This wasn't a biker war. This was open season. One day people were riding, the next they were being hunted. Sudden attacks, parked bikes, and bodies left behind. This was years of ambushes, surprise executions, and bodies dropping in places no one expected. Two of the most feared biker clubs in North America went head-to-head, and once it started, there was no off-switch. No peace talks, no clean endings, just retaliation stacked on top of retaliation. Two clubs locked into a war so heinous that the violence became a routine. This is the story of the Hells Angels versus the Sons of Silence, the most brutal biker war in history. Two clubs on the same road. To understand how the conflict between the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club and the Sons of Silence Motorcycle Club began, you first have to understand that outlaw motorcycle clubs do not operate randomly. Chapters do not appear by accident, and rivalries do not form because of one bad interaction. Everything moves slowly, through decisions that are made internally, and often long before anyone outside notices a problem. The Hells Angels were founded in California in 1948, and from early on, the club developed a reputation for expansion. What began as a local motorcycle club gradually turned into a network of chapters that stretched across the United States and later into other countries. As the club grew, it developed a consistent way of operating. When a new chapter was established, it was not treated as temporary. It was expected to stay, build influence, and represent the club's interests in that area. Over time, this approach reshaped how other motorcycle clubs reacted to the Hells Angels. In some places, smaller clubs aligned with them. In others, clubs avoided direct contact altogether. What mattered was that the Hells Angels' presence forced decisions. Ignoring them was rarely an option, because doing nothing could be interpreted as allowing influence to slip away. The Sons of Silence formed later, in 1966, in Colorado. Their growth followed a different pattern. Instead of pushing outward rapidly, they focused on establishing themselves firmly in specific regions. Their chapters tended to settle into areas and remain there, building relationships and routines that made their presence feel permanent. Once established, they expected their control of those areas to be respected without constant reinforcement. For many years, the two clubs existed without direct conflict. They were aware of each other, but their territories and interests did not overlap in ways that forced confrontation. That balance began to change as both organizations expanded and as certain regions became more valuable for reasons unrelated to population size or visibility. These areas mattered because of location, access, and the ability to move people, goods, and money through them without interference. When both clubs began operating in the same regions, the situation did not immediately turn violent. At first, the overlap created uncertainty rather than open hostility. Members noticed unfamiliar patches appearing more frequently. Clubhouses and bars that had once felt predictable no longer were. These changes were discussed internally, often without urgency, but they were not ignored. Leadership within each club had to decide how to interpret what they were seeing. Was the other club simply passing through, or were they establishing a long-term presence? Those questions mattered because the answer determined whether a response was necessary. In outlaw motorcycle culture, failing to respond to a perceived challenge can have long-term consequences. It can invite further encroachment and signal a loss of control. At the same time, responding too aggressively carries its own risks. Violence draws attention, both from rivals and from law enforcement. Once that attention is drawn, it becomes difficult to manage. For this reason, early stages of conflict are often marked by restraint rather than aggression. Each side watches the other, waiting to see whether the situation resolves itself or demands action. As time passed and neither club withdrew, the overlap became harder to dismiss. What might have initially been interpreted as coincidence began to look intentional. That shift in perception is critical, because once intent is assumed, neutrality disappears. The situation stops being about coexistence and starts being about control. By the time the first acts of violence occurred, the conflict was already well developed inside both organizations. Decisions had been discussed, weighed, and accepted. Members understood that the situation was no longer temporary and that whatever followed would likely escalate rather than resolve quickly. From the outside, it would later appear as though the war began suddenly. In reality, it was the result of a long series of decisions, none of which seemed dramatic on their own. The war did not begin with anger or chaos. It began when two clubs reached the same conclusion separately, that the ground they were standing on could not be shared without one of them losing credibility. That realization set everything else in motion. Who actually decides? In late 2018, riders from Hell's Angels began appearing more often along routes that Sons of Silence chapters had treated as routine for years. Not large groups, and not anything dramatic, just enough bikes to be noticed by people who knew what they were looking at. The same patches showed up again and again, in places where they had not been before, and at first nobody reacted. That is normal. One appearance does not mean anything in this world. Even two can be written off. Acting too early creates problems that do not need to exist, and the people who survive long enough to hold influence understand that. What changed was repetition. The same faces began turning up along the same stretches of road. The same bars, the same rest points, spread out over weeks and then months. Nothing hostile happened, but nothing random felt random anymore either. Places that had always felt predictable stopped feeling that way. That kind of shift does not trigger confrontations, but it does trigger conversations. Not loud ones and not emotional ones, just quiet discussions among people who have seen similar situations before and know how quickly they can get out of hand if misread. Those conversations did not happen everywhere at once. They started regionally, then moved upward as patterns became harder to dismiss. People compared notes. Who had seen what, where, and how often? Not rumors, just repetition. When the same details keep coming back, coincidence stops being a convincing explanation. By early 2019, Sons of Silence leadership in certain areas stopped treating the presence as temporary. They did not announce anything or issue warnings, but behavior shifted. Rides stopped lingering in places that suddenly felt shared. Stops were adjusted. Members were told, calmly and without explanation, to be aware of where they were spending time. On the other side, Hell's Angels leadership was watching the same reactions. Movement like that does not happen accidentally, and it does not continue unless someone is paying attention to how it lands. Routes that repeat themselves are chosen. When those routes keep getting used, it is because nobody has been told to stop. That alone says something. Each side believed it was being patient. Each side believed the other was testing limits. Neither side wanted to be the one that backed off first, because backing off without a reason is not neutral in this culture. It becomes part of the story later. As months passed without adjustment from either club, restraint stopped feeling passive and started feeling deliberate. Members sensed it, even if nobody spelt it out. Movements became intentional instead of habitual. People paid more attention to who else was around and where they were standing. Nobody wanted to force a confrontation because that kind of move creates chaos and attracts attention. But nobody wanted to be remembered as the side that did nothing either. That balance became harder to hold the longer the overlap continued. By the time anyone on the ground felt certain that something was coming, the decision had already settled somewhere quieter. Not a dramatic decision and not one spoken out loud, but an understanding that pretending the situation would resolve itself no longer made sense. From that point forward, even small actions carried weight. Because everyone involved knew the overlap was no longer accidental and no longer temporary. Certain roads matter more. Not every place that shows up in a biker conflict looks important from the outside. Some of the places that mattered most in the early stages of this war were easy to overlook. Small towns, highway exits, stretches of road that most people drove through without thinking twice. What made them valuable had nothing to do with how they looked and everything to do with how they connected one place to another. For motorcycle clubs, movement is constant. Chapters are spread out. Members travel for meetings, events, and runs that link one area to the next. Over time, certain routes become familiar, then expected. You know where you stop. You know where you don't. You know which towns are easy to pass through and which ones require more awareness. When those patterns stay consistent, nobody questions them. The problem starts when those patterns change. As both clubs expanded, they didn't just add chapters, they added traffic. More riders moving between states, more bikes passing through the same corridors. The Midwest and Northern Plains mattered in this way because they weren't destinations. They were connectors. Control those connectors, and you don't need to dominate major cities to have influence. You only need to make movement predictable for yourself and uncertain for everyone else. That's why overlap along certain highways and regional routes created tension long before violence followed. When riders from different clubs start using the same roads regularly, they notice each other. When they start stopping in the same places, other people notice too. A bar that sees the same group week after week starts adjusting without being asked. A repair shop does the same. These shifts don't come with announcements, but they don't go unnoticed either. Once a route starts feeling shared, leadership has to decide whether it still belongs to them. That decision is rarely simple. Pulling back can look like conceding ground, especially if the other club stays put. Holding ground means increased exposure, more chances for friction, and more opportunities for things to go wrong. Neither option is clean, and both carry consequences that last longer than the initial choice. Members feel these changes before they're ever discussed openly. A ride that used to feel routine starts feeling deliberate. Stops are shortened. Conversations stay tighter. People pay more attention to who else is around and how long they're staying. None of this feels dramatic in the moment, but it adds up. When riding stops being automatic and starts being calculated, it's a sign that something underneath has shifted. What makes roads and routes so dangerous in these conflicts is that they can't be hidden. You can avoid a clubhouse. You can skip a bar. You can change meeting locations. Roads don't move. If two clubs rely on the same corridors, they will cross paths whether they want to or not. Each crossing creates another opportunity for tension, another moment that can be read the wrong way, another incident that has to be explained internally. As time passed and neither side adjusted its movement, certain areas stopped feeling negotiable. They became lines instead of routes. Once that happens, everything around them tightens. Instructions become more specific. Members are reminded to stay alert, not because something has happened yet, but because something might. By the time leadership on either side accepted that these roads could not be comfortably shared, the conflict had already taken on shape. It was no longer abstract or theoretical. It lived in maps, habits, and daily decisions. Every mile traveled carried more meaning than it used to, and every crossing reinforced the sense that the situation was heading somewhere it could not easily turn back from. Pressure without noise.
It was around 11 a.m. when the engines were roaring and Hell's Angels members left the Newmarket area. Riders were headed south on the Don Valley.
Once it was clear that certain routes and stops were no longer accidental points of overlap, the situation shifted into a phase that most people outside this world never notice. Nothing explodes at this stage. There are no public scenes, no dramatic confrontations, and no moments that look like the beginning of a war. Instead, pressure starts getting applied in ways that are easy to deny and hard to ignore. This is the period where both sides are still deciding how far the other is willing to go and whether backing off is even an option anymore. The first signs show up in movement. A group of Hell's Angels rides through an area they've been passing through quietly for months, but this time they linger a little longer than usual, not long enough to cause a scene, but long enough to be noticed by the same people who always notice. On another day, Sons of Silence riders appear in a place they normally wouldn't stop, sit for a short time, then leave without incident. Nobody speaks to anyone they don't know. Nobody makes threats. The message isn't in words, it's in repetition. These appearances start stacking up. A familiar bar sees both patches within the same week. A gas station that used to feel neutral suddenly feels watched. A small adjustment in timing here, a change in route there. Each move is small enough to be dismissed on its own, but together they begin to narrow the space both clubs can operate in without acknowledging the situation directly. For members on the ground, this phase is uncomfortable in a quiet way. You're not told there's a problem, but you're told to be careful. You're not warned about anything specific, but routines change just enough to let you know something is being monitored. You start seeing the same faces more often, and you start recognizing patterns that weren't there before. Nobody talks about it openly, because talking openly forces things to become real. Leadership watches closely during this time, not just for what the other club is doing, but for how their own people react. If members start acting nervous, that's a problem. If they start acting careless, that's a bigger one. Pressure without noise only works if everyone stays disciplined. One wrong move can force escalation before either side is ready. This is also when miscalculations start happening. A presence meant to signal confidence gets read as provocation. A move intended as restraint gets interpreted as avoidance. Because nothing is stated directly, everything becomes interpretation, and interpretation depends on perspective. Once those perspectives drift too far apart, the risk of collision increases fast. Outsiders begin adjusting too, even if they don't understand why. A bar owner starts closing earlier on certain nights. A shop becomes less welcoming without explaining anything. People who have nothing to do with either club sense that something is off and change their behavior accordingly. These small adjustments feed back into the conflict by reinforcing one side's sense of control and the other's sense of being challenged. What makes this stage dangerous is how long it can last. Pressure without noise can stretch on for months, sometimes longer, building tension without releasing it. Every uneventful day adds to the sense that something is being delayed rather than avoided. The longer it continues, the harder it becomes to believe that the situation will resolve itself without someone forcing it to. Eventually, both sides reach the same quiet conclusion. Subtlety has done all it can do. The message has been sent, received, and rejected. Continuing to apply the same kind of pressure stops being strategic and starts being pointless. At that point, the next move has to remove doubt, even if it brings consequences that can't be managed quietly. That's when the nature of the conflict changes. The goal is no longer to signal discomfort or test reactions. That's locally. It's to make the situation unmistakable, not just to the other club, but to everyone watching from the edges. Once that decision settles in, the space for deniability collapses, and the conflict begins to show itself in ways that can't be brushed off or explained away. Silence stops working.
Says the outlaw gangs often battle over drugs and turf.
It's a nasty, dirty, bloody, vomit-covered existence, and there's nothing sexy about it when you're in it.
By mid-2019, silence was no longer buying anyone time. Hell's Angels riders were still moving through the same corridors, still stopping in the same towns, and still doing it without being challenged directly. Sons of Silence chapters in those areas had not pulled back, but they had not pushed forward either. What started as restraint began to feel like drift, and drift is dangerous when both sides are watching closely. The problem wasn't that nothing was happening. The problem was that too much had happened without resolution. The same faces had been seen too often. The same bikes had passed through too many times. At that point, continuing as if it meant nothing started to look intentional. Inside Sons of Silence circles, the question stopped being whether the Hell's Angels' presence was temporary. It became whether it was being tolerated. On the Hell's Angels' side, the read was different, but just as firm. Continued movement without confrontation suggested that the space was open enough to keep using. Not owned outright, but not defended either. In this world, that distinction matters. If ground isn't actively protected, it becomes available. That belief didn't come from arrogance, it came from experience. This is where internal pressure began to build. Members on both sides started noticing that the overlap wasn't going away. Riders talked among themselves about seeing the same patches in places that used to feel predictable. Nobody needed to exaggerate. The repetition spoke for itself. Leadership didn't need to stir anything up. The situation was already doing that on its own. Meetings changed tone again, not because people were angry, but because patience had stopped feeling productive. Silence had been useful early on. It allowed everyone to observe and gather information. Now it felt like avoidance, and avoidance, if it stretches too long, gets remembered later as weakness, whether that was the intention or not. Outside the clubs, the the situation began bleeding into daily life. Certain bars in North Dakota and surrounding areas saw tension rise even when nothing overt happened. People noticed when groups stopped overlapping naturally and started avoiding each other with purpose. That kind of avoidance draws attention. Locals might not know why it's happening, but they know when something is off. At this stage, all it takes is one incident to collapse the distance between tension and action. Not a major attack, just something that removes deniability. A confrontation that gets physical instead of ending quietly. Damage that can't be explained away as coincidence. A message that forces the other side to respond publicly. By the time leadership on either side accepted that silence was no longer controlling the situation, the space for subtlety was gone. The conflict had reached a point where continuing to do nothing would cost more than acting. Once that calculation flips, events stop drifting and start accelerating. That was the moment this stopped being a test of patience and became a test of resolve. West Fargo, October 2019.
Nobody was doing anything and they want to start shooting people. They don't leave people alone. I don't know what the problem is.
In late October 2019, the conflict stopped being something you could talk around in North Dakota. On Halloween night in West Fargo, a house fire broke out that police would later confirm was intentional and connected to the rivalry between the Hells Angels and the Sons of Silence. The location mattered. This was not a clubhouse or a biker bar. It was a residential property, and the fire came close enough to spreading that the homeowner had to grab a garden hose and fight it before firefighters arrived. West Fargo police didn't treat the incident as an accident. Investigators publicly stated that the fire was tied to an ongoing feud between the two clubs, and that statement alone changed how the situation was handled from that point forward. Once authorities put both names on the record, the conflict stopped being rumor and started being documented. In the weeks leading up to the fire, officers had already been responding to increased calls involving biker activity in Fargo. There were no public statements and no visible shows of force. Instead, movement tightened. Members avoided predictable routines. Meetings shifted locations. The understanding was clear without being said. A line had been crossed, and leaving it unanswered would invite more of the same. Retaliation followed, but not in one dramatic act. Vehicles connected to members were damaged in separate incidents. Confrontations turned physical faster than before. Law enforcement reports began referencing the rivalry directly when responding to disturbances. Each new incident reinforced the idea that this was no longer a background feud. What made the West Fargo fire different from everything before it was who it endangered. Bringing the conflict into a residential area forced everyone to acknowledge how thin the margin had become. Someone could have died who had nothing to do with either club, and that possibility sat heavy over everything that followed. From that point on, the war didn't escalate because people wanted it to. It escalated because nobody could pretend it wasn't already happening. Mandan, 3rd of July.
This morning, investigators questioning many of the nearly 200 bikers involved in a dramatic shootout that left 9 dead and 18 injured.
On the 3rd of July, 2020, the conflict spilled into the open in Mandan, North Dakota. It happened outside the Silver Dollar Bar on 1st Avenue Northeast, during a street dance that had nothing to do with biker politics on paper. Music, alcohol, a crowd packed tight enough that people assumed nothing serious could happen without someone stepping in. They were wrong. Late that night, a 33-year-old man was surrounded by several others near the edge of the gathering. Witnesses later said it didn't look like an argument that escalated. It looked like something that had already been decided. He was taken to the ground, put into a chokehold, and struck repeatedly. When the stabbing started, it happened fast, and in full view of people who didn't realize what they were watching until it was already over. Police documented 8 stab wounds, including injuries to the head and upper back. The victim survived, but barely. The fact that he lived didn't soften how the incident was treated. Officers on scene quickly realized this wasn't a random fight that got out of hand. Too many people were involved. The movement was coordinated. The speed mattered. Within days, names were attached to the attack. Nash Woolen from Williston, Gerard Lee Glazer from Bismarck, Nicholas Kinsella Greff, and Edward John Knuckles, both from Mandan. All 4 were arrested and later charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Prosecutors also filed criminal street gang charges, a step that immediately framed the attack as part of a larger conflict rather than a one-off act. Investigators connected the incident directly to the ongoing feud between the Hells Angels and the Sons of Silence. Statements collected during the investigation described Sons of Silence members targeting individuals associated with Hells Angels during the street dance. The paperwork didn't hedge. It laid out what law enforcement already believed, that the rivalry had been building for years and had now reached a point where it could no longer be contained to biker spaces. What made Mandan different from earlier incidents was how public it was. This wasn't a fire set at night or a confrontation that ended before police arrived. It was a near-fatal attack in front of witnesses, during a community event, with video, statements, and a trail that prosecutors could follow without relying on rumors. After Mandan, everything tightened. Bars and event organizers across the region started quietly pulling back from hosting anything that might draw members from either side. Police departments treated any gathering with known club presence as a potential flashpoint. Inside the clubs, movement slowed sharply. People stopped showing up where they didn't absolutely need to be. The attack didn't end the war, but it changed its pace. Once conspiracy charges entered the picture, retaliation became harder to justify and harder to hide. Every move now carried the risk of adding years, not just consequences. Mandan wasn't the bloodiest moment of the conflict, but it was the one that proved how little room was left for error. From that night forward, nobody involved could pretend the feud was still manageable. It had crossed into a space where the cost of continuing looked very different than it had before. Everything tightened at once.
Tonight, with motorcycle gangs vowing retaliation, police say their officers have now become targets, so they have stepped up patrol. Officers have also been very critical of the restaurant management here, saying they were warned of the potential violence.
After Mandan, the change wasn't announced, it was felt. Movement across North Dakota and nearby states slowed almost immediately, not because anyone agreed to stop, but because the environment stopped allowing the kind of freedom that had made escalation easy. The violence hadn't burned itself out, it had run into walls. Police presence shifted from general awareness to targeted attention. Patrol units lingered longer near places that had drawn trouble before. Traffic stops became more specific. Officers didn't need explanations anymore. They already knew which patches, bikes, and faces were tied to what they were watching. The margin for mistakes shrank fast, and everyone involved knew it. Bars that had stayed open to both sides quietly stopped taking chances. Some stopped hosting events altogether. Others made it clear, without saying it directly, that certain groups were no longer welcome at the same time. It wasn't ideology, it was risk management. Nobody wanted to be the next Mandan. Once a stabbing happens in the middle of a public event, every owner starts thinking about liability instead of loyalty. Inside the Hells Angels, movement became deliberate to the point of restraint. Chapters didn't disappear, but they stopped pushing presence where it wasn't absolutely necessary. Rides were smaller, stops were shorter, familiar places were avoided if they had started drawing attention. The goal wasn't retreat. It was staying out of the kind of spotlight that turns every incident into a case file. The Sons of Silence adjusted in similar ways. The Mandan arrests hit close enough to home that nobody needed convincing. Once conspiracy charges are on the table, every additional incident risks stacking sentences instead of settling scores. That reality changes behavior faster than any internal rule ever could. What's important is that this slowdown wasn't calm. It was tense. Retaliation didn't vanish, but it became selective and spaced out. People waited longer before acting. Decisions took more discussion. The impulsive edge that had driven earlier confrontations dulled, not because the conflict was resolved, but because the cost had become easier to measure. Outside pressure stayed steady. Investigations didn't close. Names stayed active in reports. Phones that had been seized were still being processed. Cases moved forward even when nothing new happened on the street. That kind of pressure doesn't create peace, but it does narrow options. When options narrow, conflicts lose momentum, whether anyone wants them to or not. By late 2020, the war had entered a holding pattern. Not an end, not a truce, but a pause enforced by consequences rather than agreement. Everyone involved understood that another public incident like Mandan wouldn't just escalate the feud. It would lock it into a legal process that couldn't be walked back. This was how the fighting slowed, not with closure, not with resolution, but with the quiet realization that continuing at the same pace would only make things worse for everyone still standing. What stuck? After the slowdown, attention shifted away from the streets and into courtrooms, not in a dramatic way, but steadily, the way cases move when there is enough evidence to keep them alive. The Mandan stabbing didn't fade into the background. It stayed active in filings, hearings, and quiet updates that mattered more to the people involved than any headline ever could. The 4 men charged after the 3rd of July incident did not disappear from the picture. Nash Woolen, Gerard Lee Glazer, Nicholas Kinsella Greff, and Edward John Knuckles remained tied to the case as it moved forward. Court documents kept the language direct: conspiracy, gang-related activity, intent to cause serious harm. The charges were not reduced to something easier to swallow, and they weren't rushed either. The pace itself became part of the pressure. For the men facing those charges, the war effectively stopped where they stood. Time slowed down into court dates, attorneys, and waiting. Whatever momentum had existed on the street didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what could be proven, what witnesses were willing to say, and what video showed when it was played back frame by frame. That kind of scrutiny strips away bravado quickly. It leaves very little room for mythology. Inside both the Hells Angels and the Sons of Silence, the effect was immediate but unspoken. The arrests and charges didn't end the rivalry, but they rewired how it was remembered. Names attached to court cases don't fade easily. They circulate, they get referenced quietly, they become examples of where escalation actually leads when it goes wrong in the wrong place. The Mandan case also changed how future incidents were handled, even when nothing officially connected them. Anything that looked coordinated now carried extra risk. Anything that happened in public drew instant comparison. People were quicker to walk away, not out of fear, but out of calculation. Once you've seen how fast a street incident can turn into a conspiracy charge, patience starts looking smarter than pride. For law enforcement, the case became an anchor. It gave context to earlier reports and a framework for evaluating anything that followed. When officers encountered members from either side after that, they weren't starting from zero. They already had a reference point, a reminder of how far the conflict had gone and how close it had come to something worse. The rivalry didn't vanish after that. It didn't heal or resolve itself. It hardened into something quieter and more controlled. The violence that followed was rarer, less visible, and far more cautious. The people who stayed active understood that the window for reckless action had closed, at least for the time being. What remained was memory. Of West Fargo, of Mandan, of how fast things moved once they crossed certain lines. That memory became part of how both clubs operated going forward. Not as a lesson spoken aloud, but as a shared understanding of what happens when a feud stops being contained and starts leaving records that can't be burned away. That's how this chapter of the conflict settled. Not with peace, and not with victory, but with consequences that stayed long after the streets went quiet again.
18 wounded.
At last count, we have 170 individuals that we have arrested. Those individuals are being charged with engaging in organized crime.
When the street activity slowed, the conflict didn't disappear. It shifted inward. County jails and state facilities across North Dakota and neighboring states began holding men connected, directly or indirectly, to what had already happened. Some were in on new charges. Others were inside for unrelated reasons. What tied them together was timing. They had all landed there while the feud was still fresh. Inside, names carried weight even when patches were gone. Everyone knew who belonged to the Hells Angels and who ran with the Sons of Silence. That knowledge didn't need to be announced. It showed in where people sat, who they spoke to, and who they avoided. Nothing had to happen for the tension to be understood. It was already there. Contact with the outside didn't stop. Phone calls went out. Attorneys moved between meetings. Family members carried information back and forth, sometimes without realizing how much they were passing along. Bits of news traveled inside faster than paperwork ever could. Who got arrested? Who bonded out? Who didn't? Each update shifted how people saw the situation, even from behind locked doors. For some, being inside froze their role in the conflict. Whatever they had been part of on the outside became fixed. There was no chance to adjust or respond. That kind of pause can harden attitudes fast. Time inside doesn't cool everything down. Sometimes it does the opposite. It gives people room to sit with what happened and decide what it meant to them. At the same time, being locked up limited options. There were no rides, no meetings, no chance encounters. The conflict couldn't be acted on directly. It had to be remembered, talked about carefully, and stored. That storage mattered, because stored conflicts don't fade. They wait. Facilities handled the situation quietly. Separation happened where it needed to. Transfers happened without explanation. Administrators didn't need headlines to understand what they were managing. They'd seen enough to know that proximity creates problems, especially when unfinished business follows people inside. Outside, the war felt paused. Inside, it felt unresolved. Men watched cases develop from a distance. They heard about hearings and delays. They learned who was cooperating and who was staying silent. Those details mattered. Silence inside means something different than silence on the street. It can signal loyalty. It can also signal calculation. Everyone reads it their own way. When some of those men eventually came back out, they didn't return to the same environment they had left. The streets were tighter. Attention was heavier. People moved differently. But the memories came with them. West Fargo didn't disappear. Mandan didn't fade. Those moments stayed sharp because they had never been closed out properly. This is where the conflict settled into something quieter but heavier. Not active enough to explode again right away, but not finished enough to leave behind. The war lived on in waiting rooms, in monitored phone calls, and in people who knew that whatever came next would be shaped by what had already happened. Nothing burned openly during this phase. But nothing cooled either. When leadership got cornered, as time passed, the pressure stopped landing evenly. Some chapters felt it constantly, others only in bursts. But leadership across both clubs began dealing with the same problem from different angles. Decisions that once felt internal were now being shaped by things outside their control. Court calendars, surveillance, informal warnings passed along through attorneys and intermediaries. The room to maneuver kept shrinking. Inside the Hells Angels, chapter heads started weighing every move against consequences that had nothing to do with reputation. Showing strength still mattered, but strength that attracted attention carried a cost that could not be shared evenly. One bad call could put an entire chapter under scrutiny for months. That reality didn't weaken authority, it boxed it in. The Sons of Silence faced the same squeeze. Some chapters had already taken hits through arrests and court cases tied to Mandan and earlier incidents. Others were watching closely, knowing that staying quiet didn't guarantee safety, but acting openly almost guaranteed problems. Leadership conversations narrowed to timing and containment, not how to win, but how to avoid losing more than had already been lost. This pressure showed up in subtle ways. Requests took longer to answer. Meetings ended without clear direction. Instructions came down phrased carefully, leaving room for interpretation rather than demanding action. That ambiguity wasn't confusion. It was caution. And caution in this world is often mistaken for weakness by people who don't carry the responsibility of consequences. Members noticed. They didn't challenge it openly, but they felt the shift. Leaders who once moved decisively now paused more often. That pause created its own strain because loyalty depends on confidence. When confidence has to be measured against legal exposure, it changes tone. The patch doesn't feel lighter, but it starts pulling in different directions. What made this moment especially difficult was that there was no clean exit. Stepping back entirely would look like surrender. Pushing forward risked pulling federal attention into places it hadn't reached yet. Holding steady meant absorbing pressure without relief. Every option came with trade-offs, and none of them promised closure. Outside observers sometimes mistake this phase for decline. It isn't. It's compression. Authority doesn't disappear. It tightens. Decisions get made by fewer people, shared with fewer voices, and carried out more carefully. That kind of control can hold for a long time, but it requires patience that not everyone has. By this point, the war had changed shape again. It wasn't driven by anger or momentum. It was driven by constraint. Leadership wasn't trying to escalate or end things outright. They were trying to keep the situation from tipping into something that couldn't be managed at all. That cornering effect didn't bring peace. It brought restraint, and restraint held only as long as nothing else pushed too hard. Federal eyes don't blink. By the time the year rolled forward, the attention stopped feeling local. Traffic stops and patrol cars were one thing. What followed felt different. Files started moving between offices. Phone records that had sat untouched were pulled back out. Names that had only mattered inside a few counties began appearing in conversations that stretched across state lines. Agents didn't announce themselves all at once. People noticed the change when questions started coming from outside jurisdictions, when stops turned into interviews, when warrants referenced incidents months apart as if they were part of the same thread. That's when it became clear this was no longer being treated as a string of bad nights. It was being treated as a pattern. Members connected to the Hells Angels and the Sons of Silence felt it differently depending on where they stood. Some were contacted directly. Others heard about it through lawyers who suddenly had more questions than answers. Phones went quiet. Messages got shorter. People stopped speculating because speculation travels. The pressure didn't come with raids or headlines. It came with patience. Investigators waited. They watched. They connected incidents that had once felt isolated. West Fargo sat next to Mandan in the same conversations now. So did smaller confrontations that never made the news. The timeline mattered more than any single act. What changed fastest was behavior around communication. People stopped saying certain things altogether. Meetings shifted again, not because anyone expected something immediate, but because nobody wanted to be the weak link in a larger picture they could no longer see fully. The war had gained an audience that didn't respond to intimidation or reputation. It responded to records. Businesses felt the shift as well. Places that had survived the earlier phases by staying quiet realized that quiet no longer protected them. Being associated with either side, even indirectly, started to feel like an unnecessary risk. Doors closed earlier. Events disappeared from calendars. Familiar spots went dark without explanation. This didn't end anything, it narrowed it. Every move now carried the possibility of becoming evidence later. That awareness doesn't stop conflict on its own, but it changes how it's expressed. Acts that once would have happened openly were reconsidered. Timing mattered more. Location mattered more. Witnesses mattered most of all. For some, this was the first time the cost felt permanent. Fires can be repaired. Fights can be forgotten. Federal cases don't fade the same way. They stretch. They resurface. They pull in people who thought they were done with whatever they had been part of. By this stage, the war was no longer driven by momentum. It was being shaped by gravity. Everything slowed because everything weighed more, and once that weight settled in, nobody involved expected things to return to how they had been before, no matter how quiet the streets became. Quiet hits, no crowds. The violence didn't stop after Mandan. It changed how it showed up. In early 2021, a pickup truck linked to a member of the Sons of Silence was found torched outside Dickinson, North Dakota. It wasn't parked at a bar or near a clubhouse. It was left overnight in a residential area far enough from anything public that the fire could burn without interruption. By the time firefighters arrived, the cab was gone and the engine block was cracked. No witnesses came forward. No one claimed to have heard anything unusual. A few weeks later, near Minot, a garage used by associates of the Hells Angels was broken into after midnight. Tools were taken. 2 motorcycles were damaged badly enough that they couldn't be ridden. No attempt was made to steal them. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were there to destroy. The door was forced quietly, not smashed. The neighbors slept through it. These weren't accidents, and they weren't random. They were deliberate and restrained. No crowds, no confrontation, no statements made afterward. Each incident stood alone on paper, but people involved didn't read them that way. They recognized the pattern because they'd lived the earlier version of it. What mattered was what didn't happen next. There was no immediate response, no visible gathering, no public show of force. The absence of reaction was intentional. Anything loud would have drawn attention back to places everyone was trying to keep off the map. Instead, people waited. Waiting became the response. Similar incidents followed through the year: vandalism that targeted vehicles instead of people, threats delivered through damage rather than words, properties checked but not entered, lines crossed just far enough to be understood without forcing a reply that couldn't be contained. Law enforcement logged each event, but none of them were dramatic enough on their own to justify major action. That was the point. Each incident created pressure without creating a scene. Whoever was responsible understood the environment they were operating in and adjusted accordingly. For members on both sides, this phase felt different from earlier violence. It was colder, more personal. There was no adrenaline rush, no crowd to feed off, just the quiet knowledge that someone had been close enough to touch what mattered and chose when to walk away. This was how the conflict stayed alive without reigniting openly. Damage replaced confrontation. Timing replaced speed. Silence replaced noise. The war hadn't ended. It had learned how to breathe slowly, and for the people caught in it, that was almost worse. The parts nobody got back. The slowdown didn't bring relief to the people who had already been dragged through it. For them, the damage didn't pause just because the violence went quiet. It showed up later, in pieces, and usually alone. In Fargo, a small auto shop that had quietly serviced bikes for years shut its doors without notice in mid-2021. The owner didn't make a statement. He didn't need to. After police questioned him twice about people who no longer showed up, customers stopped coming. Insurance rates jumped. Suppliers hesitated. One morning, the lights just didn't come back on. The building sat empty for months before anyone touched it again. Families felt it in ways that never made reports. Kids stopped asking why their fathers were gone so often and started asking when they were coming back. Phones rang less. Holidays passed with chairs left empty without explanation. Some people moved. Not dramatically, just quietly packing up and leaving towns where their last name had started carrying weight they didn't ask for. Members who weren't charged still paid. Jobs disappeared after background checks pulled up old associations. Leases weren't renewed. Banks asked questions that didn't used to come up. Nothing about it felt coordinated, but it didn't need to be. Once a reputation settles into a place, it does its own work. In Mandan, organizers cancelled the street dance the following year. No press release, no announcement. It simply wasn't scheduled. People noticed when July rolled around and nothing was set up. The silence said enough. Nobody wanted to be remembered as the place where things went wrong. Some men tried to step back from everything without making it obvious. They rode less, showed up late, kept their distance without explaining why. That kind of withdrawal doesn't go unnoticed, but neither does forcing someone to stay when the pressure has already done its work. People were tired in a way that didn't fix itself. The war didn't leave behind a clear line where things broke. It scattered the damage. One business at a time, one family at a time, one town deciding it had seen enough. That kind of cost doesn't feel dramatic, but it lasts longer because it doesn't announce itself. By this point, nobody involved could pretend the conflict had only affected those who chose to be part of it. Too many others had absorbed the fallout without ever standing in the middle of it. The streets were quieter, but the absence of noise didn't mean things were better. It just meant the bill had come due, and it wasn't being paid all at once. What people lost during this phase wasn't territory or status, it was normalcy. And that's the one thing this kind of conflict never gives back once it's gone. What never really ends. By the time the calendar moved forward again, there was no moment anyone could point to and say it was over. No handshake, no announcement, just a gradual thinning of activity that felt more like people stepping around something dangerous than walking away from it. In Bismarck, a rider tied loosely to the Hells Angels sold his bike and left town in late 2021. He didn't patch out. He didn't explain himself. He just stopped showing up, and after a while people stopped asking. That kind of exit doesn't make noise, but it gets noticed. Others followed in smaller ways. Fewer rides, less visibility, a habit of choosing distance when proximity used to be automatic. On the other side, a Sons of Silence member who had been present during earlier tensions took a job out of state and stayed there. No ceremony, no fallout. He kept contact limited and avoided places that used to feel familiar. People understood without saying it. Not everyone wants to keep living inside something that already took more than it gave. Still, the rivalry didn't disappear. It settled into memory. Stories about West Fargo and Mandan didn't get retold often, but when they did, they were short and specific. No exaggeration. Just reminders of how fast things had moved and how little room there had been to fix it once they did. Those memories carried weight because they were tied to real outcomes, not legend. Occasionally, someone tested the edges. A look held too long. A presence noted where it hadn't been expected. Nothing exploded, but nothing reset either. The understanding remained that certain lines still existed, even if nobody was eager to cross them again. What lasted longest was the awareness. Towns remembered, law enforcement remembered, businesses remembered. So did the people who had watched everything unfold without choosing a side and paid for it anyway. That kind of memory doesn't fade on a schedule. It lingers and shapes behavior long after the events themselves stop happening. This is how wars like this actually end, if end is even the right word. Not with closure, but with fatigue. Not with peace, but with caution. The conflict didn't resolve itself. It learned its limits. And those limits are fragile. They hold only as long as everyone involved remembers why pushing past them once had cost so much. What happened between the Hells Angels and the Sons of Silence wasn't a legend or a rumor. It was real damage, real fear, and real consequences that didn't fade when the noise stopped. The streets went quiet, but the cost stayed behind. The blood feud between Hells Angels and pagans has raged for over 50 years, recently exploding again on Long Island. These rival powerhouses have battled viciously for East Coast supremacy since the 70s, leaving bodies and broken lives in their wake. The Angels, with their iconic death head patch, and the pagans, known for fierce independence, represent opposing visions of outlaw biker culture. Their latest clash involved the Angels support club, Demons of Hell, in what locals call the most brazen public confrontation in years. The gas station brawl, Long Island erupts. When it comes to motorcycle club rivalries, few run as deep or deadly as the one between Hells Angels and pagans. This latest flare-up on Long Island wasn't just some random bullshit. Tensions had been building for weeks after the Angels established a new support club in pagan territory. According to first-hand reports, the pagans were at a place called 1683 Bar for some fundraiser event. Despite what the mainstream media initially claimed, no fighting happened at the actual bar. The real trouble kicked off elsewhere. 6 members of the Demons of Hell, a Hells Angels support club, were riding alongside 3 patched Hells Angels members when they encountered pagans at a nearby gas station. That's when all hell broke loose. The video that spread across social media shows a brutal brawl erupting at the gas station. Cuts, vests with patches, were flying everywhere, fists were swinging, and at least one pagan reportedly ended up hospitalized with either a stab wound or severe head trauma. 2 Demons of Hell members apparently fled the scene so quickly they abandoned their bikes, a serious violation of club protocol. Even more shocking to anyone familiar with outlaw code, one Hells Angels member lost his cut during the fight, something considered a major disgrace in club culture. This situation didn't just materialize out of nowhere. The Demons of Hell are relatively new players on the scene, essentially replacing another Angels support club called the Abaddon Soldiers. According to sources tracking the clubs, the Abaddon Soldiers only had about 5 members and no clubhouse. The Demons of Hell stepped in sporting colors similar to the Angels and a logo clearly inspired by the famous Death Head. Support clubs are a fascinating aspect of outlaw motorcycle culture that outsiders rarely understand. They function like farm teams or affiliates to the major clubs. The Demons of Hell wear the same red and white colors as Hells Angels, and their logo is obviously inspired by the mother club's Death Head. These support clubs often handle business the main club doesn't want direct involvement with, provide extra manpower during conflicts, and serve as a recruitment pipeline. Members who prove themselves worthy might eventually prospect for the main club. What's particularly interesting about the Long Island situation is that historically, various clubs in that region have maintained a relatively peaceful coexistence. They've typically tolerated each other's presence and avoided public confrontations. This recent violence represents a significant shift in the dynamic. Public brawls like this one are increasingly rare and considered bad for business by most established clubs. Such high-profile violence inevitably draws law enforcement attention. As one commentator put it, when things like this happen in public, indictments will come down the line. You will see a bunch of mugshots coming out in the newspaper. This isn't speculation. History shows that public acts of violence between clubs often trigger RICO investigations and federal indictments months or even years later. Law enforcement agencies maintain extensive intelligence operations focused on outlaw motorcycle clubs, and viral videos of patch-wearing members brawling in public provide perfect justification for increased scrutiny. What makes this incident especially significant is the involvement of multiple Hells Angels members alongside their support club. This suggests the conflict has escalated beyond just club-level tensions to something the mother club felt required direct participation. In the hierarchy of motorcycle clubs, when patch-holding members of a major club like Hells Angels get directly involved in a street fight, it signals serious business. The aftermath of this incident will likely play out over months or even years. Federal agencies are undoubtedly already mapping networks, building cases, and planning their next moves. Meanwhile, tension between these clubs continues to simmer, with the potential for further violence always present. Detroit bloodbath, 90 shots fired. While the Long Island incident dominated headlines in biker circles, an even more alarming situation unfolded in Detroit that same week. Outside a motorcycle club on Detroit's west side, more than 90 shots were fired in what police described as a targeted attack. The early morning shooting left a security guard wounded with gunshot wounds to his leg and back. Detroit Police Lieutenant Philip Rodriguez reported that officers responded after receiving a ShotSpotter alert around 5 a.m. Upon arrival, they found the wounded security guard and dozens of shell casings scattered across the street. According to police, suspects pulled up alongside the club in a vehicle and opened fire. There may have been return fire from inside the club, though investigators were still piecing together the evidence. What makes this case particularly notable is the sheer number of shots fired, over 90 rounds. That's not a spontaneous act of violence, but a deliberate planned attack with serious firepower. The Detroit Motorcycle Club, which police described as a very quiet location, with no previous calls for service, suddenly found itself in the middle of what appears to be an escalating conflict. Lieutenant Rodriguez made a statement that applies equally to the Long Island situation. Conflict resolution is my message. We need to make sure that we respect each other and respect life. This plea for peaceful resolution stands in stark contrast to the traditional ways motorcycle clubs have settled disputes. The Detroit incident raises serious questions about the current state of relations between various motorcycle clubs in the region. While police haven't publicly identified which club was targeted or who might be responsible, the scale of the attack suggests deep-seated animosity between rival groups. Compared to the Long Island brawl, it represents a different but equally concerning approach to club conflicts, less public but potentially more lethal. This pattern of violence isn't limited to the eastern United States. Across the country and internationally, motorcycle clubs continue to clash despite increased law enforcement pressure. The old codes and territorial disputes remain powerful motivators, even as clubs have evolved in other ways. What's particularly troubling about the Detroit shooting is how it represents an escalation in firepower. While traditional club conflicts might involve fists, chains, knives, and occasionally handguns, the use of what was likely automatic or semi-automatic weapons capable of firing dozens of rounds in seconds signals a deadlier approach to interclub warfare. The question now is whether this represents an isolated incident or the beginning of a new, more lethal phase in club conflicts. Law enforcement agencies across the country are undoubtedly watching closely, concerned that what happened in Detroit might spread to other regions with active club rivalries. When members cross the line, the Iron Horseman disgrace. While conflicts between clubs dominate headlines, sometimes the most disturbing stories involve individual members whose actions bring shame to their colors. Such is the case with a member of the Iron Horseman Motorcycle Club who was recently convicted of a particularly heinous crime. A Mississippi jury convicted an Iron Horseman member known as Viking, Chad Vanstry, of fondling a 9-year-old boy. The verdict came after a 2-day trial in DeSoto County Circuit Court. This case represents the darkest side of club culture, where individual members commit acts that violate not only society's laws, but also the supposed codes of honor that clubs claim to uphold. The Iron Horsemen, while not as internationally recognized as the Hells Angels or Outlaws, have chapters across the United States and a reputation as a serious 1% club. This conviction brings unwanted attention not only to their club, but to the broader motorcycle club world. What's particularly noteworthy is how the motorcycle community itself reacts to such news. Even the most hardened supporters of outlaw motorcycle culture typically express disgust at crimes involving children. One commentator called Vanstry a disgusting human being and suggested that vigilante justice would have been appropriate. Too bad one of the family members of this child didn't get a hold of this guy. This case highlights the complex morality within outlaw motorcycle culture. While many aspects of society's laws are flouted, from drug trafficking to violence against rivals, certain lines still exist that aren't supposed to be crossed. Crimes against children represent one such boundary, and members who violate these unspoken rules often find themselves without the protection of their brothers, facing not only legal consequences but potentially club discipline as well. The case also demonstrates how motorcycle clubs increasingly find themselves under scrutiny, not just for traditional club business, but for the individual actions of their members. In today's interconnected world, a heinous crime by one member becomes associated with the patch he wears, creating public relations problems for the entire organization. Vanstry's sentencing was scheduled for October 13th, with many in both the law enforcement and motorcycle communities watching closely to see what punishment the court would deem appropriate for his crime. The conviction serves as a stark reminder that beneath the romanticized image of outlaw bikers lies the reality that some individuals use the club structure and intimidation factor to shield truly reprehensible behavior. While the brotherhood aspect of motorcycle clubs often creates a protective shield around members, cases like this frequently result in the club distancing itself from the individual. Members who bring this kind of heat and disgrace to the patch are typically out bad, expelled from the club in disgrace. However, the stain on the club's reputation remains, feeding into the negative public perception of outlaw motorcycle clubs as havens for criminals of all types. Rock Machine Arsenal, Canadian Connection. The influence and activities of outlaw motorcycle clubs extend far beyond American borders. In Canada, authorities recently arrested a member of the Rock Machine Motorcycle Club on serious weapons charges. This case provides a window into the international nature of club activities and law enforcement responses. Police in Medicine Hat, Alberta, arrested 58-year-old Clint Mayer, identified as an affiliate of the Rock Machine Motorcycle Club, after responding to reports of a suspicious vehicle. Mayer was already wanted on an outstanding warrant, but what officers found in his possession escalated the situation significantly. During the arrest, police discovered methamphetamine, and a search of his vehicle revealed a .22 caliber semi-automatic GSG MP40 with a suppressor, ammunition, a taser, and 2 cans of bear spray. For those unfamiliar with the Rock Machine, they gained notoriety during the bloody Quebec biker war of the 1990s, where they engaged in a brutal conflict with the Hells Angels that resulted in over 160 deaths. While their presence diminished for a time, the club has seen a resurgence in recent years, establishing chapters across Canada and internationally. Mayer's arrest highlights several important aspects of modern outlaw motorcycle club operations. The possession of serious weapons, particularly a submachine gun with a suppressor, suggests preparation for potential violence. The methamphetamine charge aligns with the long-standing involvement of many clubs in drug trafficking. Yet what's perhaps most telling is that Mayer was described by police as an affiliate, rather than a full-patch member, pointing to the complex network of associates and supporters that surround formal club structures. This case represents just one example of the ongoing cat-and-mouse game between outlaw motorcycle clubs and law enforcement agencies across North America. While clubs have become increasingly sophisticated in their operations, police have responded with specialized units focused specifically on monitoring and disrupting their activities. The international dimension of motorcycle club operations presents unique challenges for law enforcement. Clubs like the Hells Angels, Outlaws, Bandidos, and others maintain chapters across multiple countries, allowing them to shift operations when pressure increases in one jurisdiction. The Rock Machine, though smaller than these major international clubs, has nonetheless established an international presence, with chapters reported in Canada, the United States, and Australia. The weapons found in Mayer's possession highlight another concerning trend: the increasing militarization of outlaw motorcycle clubs. While clubs have always been armed to some degree, the sophistication of weapons seized in recent raids suggests an arms race between rival organizations. Submachine guns with suppressors, assault rifles, and even explosives have been found in club-related investigations across North America. This escalation poses significant risks not only to rival club members, but to innocent bystanders who might be caught in the crossfire. Down Under crackdown, Australia goes hard. Speaking of Australia, authorities there have recently launched a major operation targeting the Hells Angels and Comancheros motorcycle clubs. The South Coast Raptor Squad, a specialized police unit focused on organized crime, conducted simultaneous raids across multiple locations in September 2025, resulting in 11 arrests. During these raids, police seized a replica firearm, steroids, mobile phones, and other evidence related to an ongoing investigation into public violence and gang affiliation. The operation targeted properties across several areas, including Nora and Sanctuary Point, focusing on individuals linked to recent violent incidents between rival clubs. The Australian approach to outlaw motorcycle clubs has been particularly aggressive in recent years. Several Australian states have implemented specialized legislation aimed directly at disrupting these organizations, including anti-association laws that prohibit known club members from gathering together. These measures have been controversial, with critics arguing they infringe on civil liberties, while supporters point to the reduction in public violence. Of the 11 men arrested, 5 were wanted in connection with a brawl in Huskisson on August 9th. Others were charged in relation to a separate incident at the entrance on the Central Coast, with charges including a fray, weapons offences, drug possession, and dealing with proceeds of crime. Ages of those arrested ranged from young adults in their early 20s to older men in their 50s, demonstrating the multi-generational nature of these organizations. What's particularly interesting about the Australian situation is how it reflects the evolution of bikie gang enforcement. Rather than simply targeting patch members, authorities are increasingly focusing on anyone associated with or linked to these clubs. This broader approach recognizes the complex network of supporters, hangers-on, and prospects that surrounds formal club membership. The Australian crackdown also highlights an international trend: the increasing youth involvement in motorcycle club violence. Several of those arrested were described as teenagers or young men between 18 and 23 years old. This younger demographic represents a shift from the traditional image of outlaw bikers as middle-aged men, suggesting clubs are actively recruiting younger members who may bring different attitudes and approaches to club business. Video of one brawl, reportedly between Hells Angels and Comancheros supporters, showed young men in club colors fighting on a patio before spilling into a building, where police quickly intervened. The rapid police response suggests authorities were either monitoring the situation or had received intelligence about potential trouble, another sign of the increasingly sophisticated law enforcement approach to these organizations. The Australian situation mirrors what's happening in the United States and Canada: increased scrutiny, specialized law enforcement units, and a focus on disrupting not just the clubs themselves, but their broader support networks. As one jurisdiction increases pressure, clubs often shift operations elsewhere, creating a constant game of adaptation and counter-adaptation between outlaws and authorities. Australia's approach has been particularly noteworthy for its legislative innovations. Some states have implemented laws allowing authorities to declare organizations criminal groups, making membership or association itself a criminal offense. These laws have been challenged on constitutional grounds, but have generally been upheld. The effectiveness of this approach remains debated, with some arguing it has simply driven club activities underground rather than eliminating them. Red Rum Motorcycle Club, symbol wars and respect. While established clubs like the Hells Angels and Pagans dominate headlines, newer organizations like the Red Rum Motorcycle Club have also generated controversy. The Red Rum MC gained attention partly due to their unusual patch, specifically their use of a 13.5 symbol that resembles a diamond. In motorcycle club culture, symbols carry enormous significance. The traditional 1% diamond patch signifies an outlaw identity, referencing the American Motorcyclist Association's supposed claim that 99% of motorcyclists are law-abiding citizens, implying the remaining 1% are outlaws. Red Rum's use of a 13.5 symbol created confusion and controversy, with some interpreting it as a prison reference, meaning judge and jury and half a chance at winning the case. According to sources familiar with the club, Red Rum eventually changed their symbol from something that looked like a diamond to more of an arrowhead design, still containing the 13.5, but in a less controversial format. This change suggests pressure from established clubs who guard their symbols jealously and view unauthorized use of similar imagery as disrespectful. The Red Rum situation highlights how seriously traditional clubs take matters of symbolism and respect. Using patches or symbols that too closely resemble established club insignia can lead to serious consequences. This isn't just about copyright or branding. In the motorcycle club world, these symbols represent hard-earned identity and status that members have potentially risked their freedom or lives to obtain. In a bizarre twist to the Red Rum story, a video surfaced allegedly showing the club's founder, Cliff Mattis, surrounded by police. This video was posted by another controversial motorcycle group called the Twin Outlaw Brotherhood, who claimed they got to meet him in person. Very nice gentleman. The sarcastic nature of this post, showing someone clearly in trouble with law enforcement, demonstrates the complex and often petty rivalries between newer clubs trying to establish legitimacy. These newer clubs like Red Rum exist in a precarious position in the motorcycle club world. Without the history, size, or connections of established organizations, they must carefully navigate relationships with dominant clubs in their territory while trying to build their own identity and reputation. The pressure to conform to traditional expectations while still establishing uniqueness creates constant tension. The founder of Red Rum, Cliff Mattis, apparently had his own vision for the club that didn't necessarily align with traditional outlaw motorcycle club structure. This created friction both within the organization and with established clubs in their territory. Former members like Johnny, who was recently interviewed about his experiences, have provided insight into the internal politics and external pressures facing newer clubs like Red Rum. The club's name itself, Red Rum being murder spelled backward, carries implications that might attract unwanted attention from both law enforcement and traditional clubs. This kind of provocative branding represents a common challenge for newer organizations. How to establish a distinctive identity without crossing lines that might provoke violent responses from established clubs. Twin Outlaw Brotherhood, Internet Clowns. Speaking of the Twin Outlaw Brotherhood, this group represents perhaps the most unusual development in modern motorcycle club culture. The internet-famous club that serves primarily as online entertainment. The Twin Outlaw Brotherhood, sometimes mockingly called the Twin Outlaw Sisterhood, has become infamous for their social media presence, which many in traditional club circles view as a parody of actual motorcycle club culture. Videos of the Twin Outlaw Brotherhood show individuals wearing cuts, vests with patches, making bold statements about being outlaws, and generally presenting themselves as serious club members. However, their presentation, demeanor, and apparent lack of understanding about traditional protocol has made them objects of ridicule in the broader motorcycle community. One particularly bizarre video features them repeatedly stating, "We're fucking outlaws," while showing off their cuts, including what appears to be a fake bulletproof vest with a camera mounted to it. Another shows them making wild claims about other clubs and threatening to take your cuts if you don't come with love and positivity. A statement that demonstrates profound misunderstanding of how outlaw clubs actually operate. The group also posted a video allegedly showing their encounter with Cliff Mattis of the Red Rum MC, though circumstances suggest they may have simply obtained footage of him surrounded by police and presented it as a personal interaction. This type of behavior, claiming connections or confrontations that didn't occur, is particularly dangerous in the motorcycle club world, where false claims about interactions with established clubs can have serious consequences. Critics mock the Twin Outlaw Brotherhood relentlessly, noting their consistent wearing of the same clothes, apparent poor hygiene, and fundamental misunderstanding of motorcycle club protocols. Comments like, "They look like they smell like cat piss," and "cat piss and bad decisions" reflect the disdain with which traditional bikers view these internet personalities. What makes the Twin Outlaw Brotherhood particularly interesting is how they represent a modern phenomenon. Individuals with little or no connection to actual motorcycle club culture adopting its aesthetic and language for internet fame. In previous decades, claiming outlaw status without backing would have led to immediate physical consequences. Today, operating primarily in the digital realm allows such groups to exist in a strange limbo, mocked by insiders but largely ignored by the actual clubs they imitate. This phenomenon isn't unique to motorcycle culture. Across various subcultures, the internet has enabled a form of participation that would have been impossible in earlier eras. The traditional gatekeeping mechanisms that once controlled access to subcultures have been partially circumvented by social media, creating strange new hybrid identities that exist primarily for online consumption. For established clubs, groups like the Twin Outlaw Brotherhood represent an annoying but largely irrelevant sideshow. Traditional outlaw clubs are concerned with territory, business interests, and genuine rivalries, not internet personalities playing dress-up. However, the existence of such groups does potentially dilute the mystique and intimidation factor that traditional clubs have carefully cultivated over decades. The fact that the Twin Outlaw Brotherhood can openly claim outlaw status, wear patches, and make ridiculous statements about other clubs without facing physical consequences demonstrates how much the landscape has changed. In earlier decades, such behavior would have resulted in immediate and violent correction. Today, the physical and digital worlds remain sufficiently separated that internet outlaws can exist in relative safety, at least as long as they stay behind their screens. Cops and bikers, a complicated dance. The relationship between law enforcement and outlaw motorcycle clubs has always been complex and frequently adversarial. Recent incidents highlight how this dynamic continues to evolve in sometimes surprising ways. A video recently circulated showing a police officer from Lynn, possibly Massachusetts, who appeared to be intoxicated while on duty. The footage shows the officer barely able to stand or speak coherently, while his partner attempts to shield him from the person recording. The videographer repeatedly states that the officer is going to lose his job for being drunk on duty, while the partner officer tries to de-escalate the situation. This incident raises important questions about double standards in law enforcement. As many point out, civilians with gun permits face strict regulations about alcohol consumption. In most jurisdictions, having even one drink while carrying a firearm is prohibited. Yet some police officers apparently feel entitled to work while intoxicated, putting public safety at risk. The parallel to motorcycle club culture is striking. There are references to incidents where undercover police officers beat members of the Pagans MC in a bar in Pittsburgh, yet were found not guilty of wrongdoing. This type of behavior, engaging in violence while representing law enforcement, creates deep resentment in club circles and contributes to the ongoing tension between police and outlaw organizations. Another example mentioned was an undercover officer arrested for DUI in Florida while driving an unmarked car at over 100 miles per hour. According to the account, he got out thinking he was bigger than the law until they cuff snapped. These incidents of police misconduct resonate particularly strongly with motorcycle club members, many of whom feel they're held to different standards than law enforcement. The hypocrisy extends to other areas as well. Civilians cannot legally possess both a pistol permit and a marijuana card. You got to pick one or the other, you can't do both. Modern law enforcement has developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to monitoring and infiltrating motorcycle clubs. Specialized units like Australia's Raptor Squad focus exclusively on outlaw motorcycle gangs, employing tactics including surveillance, informants, and undercover operations. These efforts have yielded significant results, with major RICO cases bringing down club chapters across the country. Yet despite these successes, outlaw motorcycle clubs continue to adapt and evolve. The fundamental appeal of these organizations, brotherhood, identity, excitement, and profit, remains powerful enough to ensure new recruits continue to join despite the risks. And the perceived hypocrisy of law enforcement creates a moral justification that helps members rationalize their outlaw status. The dynamic between cops and bikers is further complicated by the fact that many law enforcement officers share interests and backgrounds with club members. Some officers are motorcycle enthusiasts themselves, and some even join clubs, typically law-abiding ones, after retirement. The line between enforcer and outlaw isn't always as clear as either side might prefer to believe. As law enforcement pressure increases and society changes, outlaw motorcycle clubs find themselves at a crossroads. The traditional model, built around territory, criminal enterprises, and rigid hierarchies, faces challenges from both external forces and internal evolution. The increased scrutiny from specialized police units makes traditional criminal activities riskier than ever. The use of RICO statutes allows prosecutors to target entire club chapters based on the actions of a few members. Sophisticated surveillance technology makes maintaining operational security increasingly difficult, and the proliferation of cameras, both official and in everyone's pockets, means club activities that once occurred in shadows now risk exposure on social media within minutes. At the same time, the culture that surrounds and sustains these clubs is changing. The traditional recruitment pool, young working-class men with military experience, has shifted demographically. The mystique and secrecy that once surrounded clubs has been partially dispelled by books, documentaries, reality TV shows, and endless social media content. The romanticized outlaw image competes with mockery from groups like the Twin Outlaw Brotherhood and critical coverage from mainstream media. Yet despite these challenges, outlaw motorcycle clubs show remarkable resilience. They continue to attract new members, expand into new territories, and adapt their operations to changing circumstances. The fundamental appeal, brotherhood, identity, status, and excitement remains powerful enough to ensure their survival even as their form evolves. Some clubs have responded by becoming more secretive about their criminal activities while maintaining public faces through charity events and community engagement. Others have shifted toward legitimate businesses, using the club's fearsome reputation as a marketing tool rather than an instrument of intimidation. Still others have doubled down on their outlaw identity, willing to accept increased risk in exchange for maintaining tradition. The international dimension adds another layer of complexity. While clubs in the United States might face increasing pressure, chapters in Eastern Europe, Asia, and Australia often operate with different constraints and opportunities. This global presence allows organizations to shift resources and personnel across borders, maintaining overall strength even as individual chapters face crackdowns. The rise of technology has created both challenges and opportunities. While surveillance increases risk, encrypted communication allows for more secure planning. Social media exposes club activities, but also provides recruitment tools and platforms for shaping public perception. The internet has democratized access to club culture, but also diluted its authenticity through imitators and pretenders. The future of outlaw motorcycle clubs will likely involve increased stratification between different types of organizations. The major international clubs, with decades of history and sophisticated structures, will continue to adapt and evolve, finding new business models and operational security measures. Smaller, newer clubs may struggle with the increased scrutiny and competition, either fading away or being absorbed into larger organizations. The use of support clubs, as seen with the Demons of Hell on Long Island, represents one adaptive strategy that will likely become more common. By creating buffer organizations that handle higher-risk activities, major clubs attempt to insulate their core membership from direct legal exposure. Whether this approach proves effective in the long term remains to be seen, as prosecutors increasingly target entire support networks rather than just mother clubs. Beyond the patch, the human side of club life. Behind the headlines about violence, arrests, and rivalries, it's important to remember that motorcycle clubs consist of individuals with complex motivations and life stories. While media and law enforcement tend to present a one-dimensional view of these organizations as simply criminal enterprises, the reality is more nuanced. Many club members joined seeking brotherhood, identity, and purpose. Veterans returning from combat have historically found motorcycle clubs provide the structure, adrenaline, and camaraderie they experienced in military service. Others come from troubled backgrounds and find acceptance and protection within the club structure that they never experienced elsewhere. This doesn't excuse criminal behavior, but helps explain the powerful appeal these organizations continue to hold despite increased legal risks. The colors, traditions, and rituals provide meaning in a world many members find otherwise alienating or hostile. The respect shown to patch holders within the club world contrasts sharply with the marginalization many experienced in mainstream society. Personal narratives from former members often reveal motivations and experiences that challenge simplistic understandings of outlaw motorcycle culture. Former members like Johnny from the Red Rum MC provide insight into the internal politics, personal relationships, and day-to-day realities of club life that rarely make headlines. These personal accounts highlight how the boundaries between outlaw and lawman are sometimes blurrier than either side would care to admit. Former police officers sometimes join motorcycle clubs after retirement. Club members occasionally become informants. The human element introduces unpredictability into what might otherwise appear to be clearly defined opposing forces. The motivations for joining clubs vary widely. Some members are attracted by the criminal opportunities, others by the brotherhood and sense of belonging. Some join for protection, others for status and respect. Many are drawn by a combination of these factors, finding in club life a complex mix of benefits and obligations that satisfy various psychological and practical needs. Exit paths from clubs are similarly varied. Some members leave voluntarily after growing tired of the lifestyle or facing family pressure. Others are forced out for violations of club rules or personal conflicts. Some cooperate with law enforcement to escape legal consequences, while others serve their time and return to club life afterward. These diverse experiences reflect the complex human realities behind the monolithic public image of outlaw clubs. The path to peace, conflict resolution in club culture. As Lieutenant Rodriguez wisely noted following the Detroit shooting, conflict resolution is my message. We need to make sure that we respect each other and respect life. This sentiment, coming from a law enforcement officer, echoes what many veterans of club life have come to realize. Endless cycles of violence benefit no one. While traditional rivalries between clubs like the Hells Angels and Pagans remain intense, there have been examples of successful conflict resolution in the club world. In some regions, rival clubs have established truces or territorial agreements that minimize violent confrontations. These arrangements often come after particularly costly conflicts where both sides recognize the futility of continued violence. The push for conflict resolution comes from multiple directions. Older members, having seen the consequences of decades of violence, often advocate for more strategic approaches to inter-club relations. Law enforcement pressure creates common enemies that sometimes bridge traditional rivalries, and the increasing scrutiny that follows public violence makes peaceful coexistence appealing from a business perspective. However, tradition and pride remain powerful forces. For decades, certain clubs have been bitter enemies, and that history isn't easily forgotten. Young members eager to make names for themselves may push for more aggressive responses to perceived disrespect. And in some regions, genuine business conflicts over territory and criminal enterprises make peaceful coexistence difficult. The international dimension adds additional complexity. While clubs in one region might reach an understanding, their chapters elsewhere may continue conflicts. The Hells Angels and Bandidos, for example, maintain a generally peaceful relationship in some countries while remaining bitter rivals in others. The increased law enforcement pressure has created another interesting dynamic. In some cases, clubs that historically were enemies have found common cause against police targeting. This enemy of my enemy thinking has occasionally led to unexpected alliances, or at least non-aggression pacts between formerly hostile groups. Technology and social media have also changed how conflicts develop and escalate. As seen with the Twin Outlaw Brotherhood, online provocations can create tensions that might eventually spill into the real world. Clubs must now manage their image and respond to challenges across multiple domains: physical, legal, and digital. The potential for peaceful resolution exists, but it requires leadership on all sides, willing to prioritize long-term stability over short-term vengeance. As one commentator noted regarding the Long Island situation, a lot of these people are the same types of people. They would get along if they didn't have a cut on and they didn't have allegiance to one side. They're the same types of people, and it's a sad situation. The evolution of club violence. Strategy replaces chaos. The nature of violence between motorcycle clubs has evolved significantly over the decades. The wild bar brawls and chaotic street fights of the 1960s and 70s have largely given way to more calculated strategic actions. This evolution reflects both increased law enforcement scrutiny and the professionalization of club operations. Early club conflicts often erupted spontaneously over perceived disrespect, territorial incursions, or personal grudges. These confrontations typically involved fists, pool cues, chains, and occasionally knives or handguns. They were public, messy, and often involved multiple participants on both sides. Today's club violence tends to be more targeted and deliberate. The Detroit shooting, with over 90 rounds fired in a pre-dawn attack, exemplifies this approach. Rather than chaotic brawls, modern conflicts often involve planned hits against specific targets. This reduces the risk of arrest during the act itself, but creates evidence trails through planning and communication that savvy law enforcement can exploit. The Long Island gas station brawl represents something of a throwback, a public confrontation caught on camera. This old-school approach is increasingly rare precisely because it creates such obvious legal exposure. As one observer noted, when things like this happen in public, indictments will come down the line. Modern clubs increasingly employ a strategic calculus when considering violent action. Is the target worth the potential heat? Will the action advance club interests or merely satisfy personal vendettas? Can the operation be conducted with minimal exposure? How will other clubs and law enforcement respond? This professionalization of violence reflects the broader evolution of outlaw motorcycle clubs, from loose confederations of rebellious bikers to sophisticated criminal organizations. While the public image often remains rooted in the wild, impulsive outlaw stereotype, the reality behind closed doors is increasingly businesslike and calculating. Yet despite this evolution, certain constants remain. Violence still serves as the ultimate arbiter of disputes. Respect and reputation still drive many conflicts. And the willingness to use force remains a defining characteristic that separates outlaw clubs from their law-abiding counterparts. The road goes on. The recent incidents we've explored, from the Long Island brawl between Hells Angels supporters and pagans to the Australian crackdown on bikie gangs, represent snapshots of an evolving cultural and criminal landscape. Outlaw motorcycle clubs continue to adapt to increasing pressure from law enforcement, changing social norms and technological developments that have transformed how these organizations operate. Traditional rivals like the Hells Angels and pagans continue their decades-long antagonism, but the nature of their conflicts has changed. Support clubs like the Demons of Hell play increasingly important roles, allowing major clubs to maintain influence while creating distance from direct criminal liability. International connections provide both opportunities and challenges, with clubs operating across national boundaries. Law enforcement has become more sophisticated in targeting these organizations, with specialized units employing advanced tactics and legal strategies. Yet despite these efforts, the fundamental appeal of outlaw motorcycle clubs ensures their continued existence and adaptation. Perhaps the most significant change is the increased visibility of club activities. In earlier decades, what happened in the club world largely stayed there, with limited media coverage and public awareness. Today, cell phone videos of brawls go viral within hours. Internet personalities appropriate club aesthetics for online fame. The mystique that once surrounded these organizations has been partially dispelled by constant exposure. Yet despite these changes, certain constants remain. The power of symbols like the Death Head or the 1% diamond, the importance of respect and territory, the complex moral codes that govern behavior within these subcultures. These elements have persisted through decades of evolution and will likely continue to define outlaw motorcycle culture for years to come. As Lieutenant Rodriguez wisely noted in his plea following the Detroit shooting, conflict resolution remains the healthiest path forward. Whether clubs will increasingly embrace this approach or continue traditional patterns of rivalry and violence remains to be seen. What's certain is that outlaw motorcycle clubs will continue to adapt and evolve, maintaining their place in the criminal landscape while preserving the traditions and brotherhood that give these organizations their enduring appeal. The story of outlaw motorcycle clubs is far from over. New chapters are being written every day as the next generation of members carries forward traditions while adapting to changing circumstances. For law enforcement, citizens, and club members themselves, understanding this complex and evolving culture remains as challenging and important as ever. Not merely a biker feud, this was a struggle for California's soul. The streets went from motor noise to blood the next day. There were ambushes, drive-by shootings, and bodies left where no one would have expected them. The war went from the beaches to the deserts, and it was fought over the land that two of North America's most feared biker clubs claimed as their own. A new, deadly club called the Mongols MC threatened the Hells Angels, the Road Monarchs. An argument over land swiftly escalated into a horrific war that appeared natural. Nobody discusses peace, none speak. Returning attacks. A fight between the Mongols and the Hells Angels transformed California's biker scene forever. Formation of the Mongols MC. Mongols Motorcycle Club was founded in Montebello, California, in the late 1960s by motorcycle enthusiasts. They felt excluded since established groups like the Hells Angels were in charge. The Mongols intended to create something different from normal motorcycle culture, not just ride for fun. They stated they will challenge the status quo from the start. When the Mongols founded, the Hells Angels were the world's most powerful illegal motorcycle organization. They dominated American motorcycling. They were powerful in the US and abroad due to their aggressive, law-breaking, and disobedient behavior. These Hells Angels felt superior and in charge. They governed a huge territory and became a global brand and biker club. The Hells Angels symbolized everything smaller, less established organizations desired to be and threatened them. Their strength and apparent power made them dangerous and intriguing. But the Mongols were different. They didn't want to conform. They wanted their own Hells Angel free space. They chose not to emulate the Angels' ascension or dwell in their shadow. The Mongols aspired to actively challenge the system, which required an aggressive, independent spirit from the outset. The club's name, a reference to the Mongol Empire, signified its desire to aspire to unstoppable dominance. This was a brotherhood with a resistance and defiant philosophy, not merely motorcycle riders. Motorcycle enthusiasts knew the Mongols broke the rules. Many clubs wanted to retain relationships, build hierarchical structures, and be part of the greater motorcycle culture, whereas the Mongols wanted to change things. They were brothers who prioritized loyalty, power, and leadership, not just riding together. They wanted to make friends and wield power in a biker world. They thought the Hells Angels were overly confident in being the best and ready to battle. By the early 1970s, the Mongols had spread outside California and affected neighboring states and the US. The Mongols planned their growth and picked where to settle, unlike other illegal gangs. They built strongholds slowly to ensure they built chapters and long-lasting, well-protected areas. This growth made their plans clear and challenged the Hells Angels, who had previously assumed their areas were safe. Their fame grew as the Mongols grew stronger. They were hostile and would do anything to stay outlaw bikers. Any challenger to their existence was met with fierce combat by the Mongols. Unlike regular clubs, this did business differently. They rode motorcycles to display power, respect, and bravery, not simply for fun. The Mongols believed their ascension was inevitable and necessary to overthrow the current order. Even though they employed violence, the Mongols recruited loyal, eager fighters for the club. They were known for their close brotherhood and readiness to protect each other. That commitment came with a hazardous pledge to be violent and avenge people, which would define their interactions with other clubs, especially the Hells Angels. The Mongols divided early on. They were rebels who wanted to leave their mark on history, but they would do anything to protect it, even from the Hells Angels. The Hells Angels' domain hampered the Mongols' rise. As they grew, the two clubs met. Because they were growing stronger, the Mongols moved into Hells Angels' long-held territory. After dominating the biker world, the Hells Angels considered the Mongol invasion as an affront. The Angels considered the Mongols a nuisance, a gang of outcasts who didn't know their place. The Mongols had been waiting for this challenge to prove they weren't simply a footnote in outlaw motorcycle clubs, but a force that could compete with the big guys. Mongols avoided direct combat as well. They plotted every step since they knew the Hells Angels would be tough. They waited, watched, and steadily transformed the biker environment in California by creating incremental power shifts. The Mongols initially employed raw power, strategic location, alliances, and most crucially, a strong and resilient image to attract the Hells Angels. However, they waited for the ideal time to attack, and tension between the clubs was rising. After tiny territorial disputes, both sides realized California's vast network of roads, bars, and clubs couldn't support them for long and went to war. As the Mongols strengthened, the Hells Angels had to react. The Mongols were striving to survive and prove they were the finest, changing the California biker world forever. Origins and rise of the Hells Angels MC. In 1948, the Hells Angels motorcycle group, the world's most notorious outlaw biker group, began in San Bernardino, California. The Hells Angels were founded by a few World War II veterans. Each felt rebellious and wanted to make something against society's rules. Sonny Barger, the club's inaugural president, wanted to use his military expertise for good. They sought independence, freedom, and utter rejection of social standards. They created a motorcycle club to bring back brotherhood and create a free space. The US motorcycling scene was new, and most clubs were tiny and local when they started. The Hells Angels, on the other hand, soon distinguished themselves by focusing on both the motorbike ride and a strong identity. It was evident from the start that their club would be unique. Unlike most post-war Americans, they led a violent existence. The moniker Hells Angels was chosen specifically to convey their desire to be feared and respected. The Hells Angels expanded beyond California in the 1950s by creating chapters in major US cities. They were known for being rebellious and anti-establishment, with members following an outlaw lifestyle. Over time, they became the world's most powerful outlaw motorcycle club with chapters worldwide. Their organizational skills were crucial to their success. Hells Angels chapters also formed a network that allowed them to work in numerous areas. Their chapters worked together, promoting the club in US and international cities. The club expanded for a cause. They aspired to rule land, and their methods were violent but effective. They utilized force against resistance. Everyone knew they used threats and violence to get what they wanted, but many thought they were unbeatable. Several high-profile occurrences made the Hells Angels famous in the 1960s and 1970s. The Woodstock Festival in 1969, when they were in charge of security, was their most famous, if not best, moment. They were employed to maintain calm, but things swiftly escalated. The Stones concert killed a fan. The Hells Angels were notorious for their wild, destructive ways after Woodstock's violence garnered attention. Despite the negative attention, these events strengthened the Hells Angels. Each violent occurrence made them more mysterious and impenetrable. Apparently, causing disturbance gave them more power. Their negative reputation became respect, especially among bikers. Many considered the Hells Angels an institution, not merely a gang. They weren't sorry for being aggressive because they considered it part of who they were. Growing criminal activity helped them maintain power. The Hells Angels ran drug, guns, and protection networks, in addition to owning land. This range of unlawful companies helped them acquire money and gain power. The club was involved in organized crime by the 1970s. They were a criminal empire and motorcycle club. While growing in power, the Hells Angels made adversaries. They faced opposition from smaller clubs, local governments, and competing gangs as they grew. Violence and hatred increased with land rivalry, notably in California. In this intense competition, the Mongols' MC grew. The Hells Angels neglected the Mongols because they were annoying. Newcomers were seeking to take over California and beyond. The Hells Angels soon discovered that the Mongols wanted other rules. Mongols were determined to keep their place in the biker world. The Hells Angels and Mongols fought for power, not merely motorcycle groups. The Hells Angels wanted to maintain California, their stronghold and their most powerful place. The Mongols aspired to challenge the world's strongest club. California was fought for pride, dignity, and the ambition to be the best outlaw biker, not just territory. It was harder for the Hells Angels to control California in the 1980s. By losing authority inside and outside the club, they had to adjust to maintain control. The Hells Angels faced challenges that would push them to the limit as their foes, especially the Mongols, strengthened. In this intense atmosphere, the two clubs' war began, setting the stage for a devastating fight that would reshape California's biker culture forever. Initial tensions between the two clubs. The Hells Angels had dominated the motorcycling world for years until the Mongols Motorcycling Club gained popularity in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They controlled land, enterprises, partnerships, and criminal groups. Due to their long-time violence, menace, and rule, the Hells Angels earned a poor reputation. They were used to street victory. They controlled key areas in California, where they established chapters in major cities. Someone straying too close to their domain was annoying and a disrespect to their authority. But Mongols weren't like most new gangs. Other clubs would have asked for permission or waited for respect, but the Mongols were daring. They wanted to change the scene, not just be there. When Mongols opened chapters in Southern California and elsewhere, Hells Angels noticed. Hells Angels thought they owned significant cities, roads, taverns, and clubs, but the Mongols took them. Definitely not an accident. It was hard. The Hells Angels would soon discover the Mongols' tenacity. Small battles between Mongols and Hells Angels started the conflict. These occurrences were initially unreported. Not many outside the motorcycle club world saw these clashes, but they were essential. An argument at a bar and a fight at a local event started the fire. The Mongols slowly invaded Hells Angels' territory to test their mettle. The Hells Angels were responding to the Mongols' pressure, even though they didn't think they had to battle them right soon. The Mongols were distinct from rival clubs since they wanted their spot. Hells Angels responded because they were used to fighting disrespectful people. The Mongols advanced for the first time, despite their efforts. Smaller clubs might retreat after a few brutal clashes, but the Mongols battled back and showed they weren't going away. Cultural and physical challenges were present. The Hells Angels knew the Mongols were offering them an alternative besides leadership. Hells Angels, notorious for their violence, became more so. They used their vast electrical network to drive the Mongols from key locations. The battle had escalated into a land war. As the Mongols invaded Hells Angels' territory, the stakes rose. In addition to defeating the Mongols, it was about survival. They needed to show their power. Hells Angels needed to maintain their title as motorcycle world leaders. They couldn't lose land to the Mongols because it would have been shameful. Increased tensions led to the first big violence. Mongols attacking Hells Angels members and their symbols indicated how serious the attacks were. People targeted chapter leaders, clubhouses, and key members of both groups. The violence was mental and physical. Every onslaught and threat reminded the Hells Angels that the Mongols wouldn't retreat. Every Hells Angels retaliation proved the Mongols that they were on the right track, that their challenge was heard, and that they had made a difference. There was more to the fight than violence. Power, respect, and influence were also at stake in outlaw biker clubs. Hells Angels were a brand, not just a group. They had influence beyond the streets and a meaningful name. They established a network of enterprises, groups, and even a public image around their status as the best club in the world. In contrast, the Mongols were trying to establish themselves in a Hells Angel-ruled globe. The Mongols threatened the Hells Angels' territory and power. By showing they were willing to fight the Hells Angels, the Mongols forced them to reconsider. Their reputation was no longer enough. They had to act rapidly to maintain it. However, the Hells Angels' replies worsened things. Violence escalated, and the conflict spiraled out of control. There was more to the Mongol Hells Angel conflict than land conflicts. They were about power, pride, and outlaw motorcycle dominance. Both clubs strived for excellence. It took blood, bloodshed, and betrayal to get there. A few confrontations quickly developed into a battle. Neither club could escape. As the battle escalated, both clubs recognized there would be no easy solution, only one winner. Violence increased, making it evident that the war over California's streets would continue until one club was destroyed or surrendered. The battle for California territory begins. In the 1980s, the Hells Angels and Mongols knew they had to stop fighting. A few small clashes in the late 1970s had escalated into a full-scale war over California, which both clubs considered critical to their existence. Power, influence, and reputation were at risk, not simply land. California was the hub of American motorcycling, not simply a state. The Hells Angels and Mongols aspired to rule California, the illegal motorcycle capital. Hells Angels spent years developing their California empire. From Southern California beaches to northern mountains and deserts, they were powerful. Their clubhouses were everywhere, demonstrating their supremacy. They dominated state unlawful activity and controlled streets, bars, and roads. The Hells Angels' vast network controlled California's biker scene's physical, economic, and social aspects. This comprised drugs, firearms, and protection rackets. The Mongols realized they had to face this level of might to threaten the Hells Angels. Mongols struggled to rise. Their goal was to alter power, not only bars and clubs. Mongols were never content with second-tier status. They thought they were equally or better than the Hells Angels. Hells Angels were difficult to defeat. Hells Angels were a brand, formidable gang, and motorcycle club with decades of military experience. They wouldn't allow the Mongols conquer their territory without a fierce war. But the Mongols stuck to their purpose. They rose to fame as rough and belligerent. It wasn't their style to compromise. Their commitment was long-term. They wanted to make a point, not just take land. The Mongols fought the Hells Angels for California and the outlaw biker world's identity. In 1983, the Mongols invaded Southern California, the Hells Angels' home territory, causing the first major conflict. The move was deliberate. The Mongols crept into strategic towns, made friends with local gangs, and formed a support network before taking over. Hells Angels were shocked. They underestimated the Mongols' determination and how difficult it would be to stop them from marching in difficult ways. Many violent clashes followed. They weren't spontaneous conflicts, they were organized attacks. The Mongols were fighting the Hells Angels network, not just a bar or street corner. Both sides quickly realized that the struggle was about survival rather than land due to the severe bloodshed. The Hells Angels retaliated as fiercely as the Mongols every time. First in decades, Hells Angels had to defend themselves. Their California home was unsafe. War erupted in the streets. Violence expanded to pubs, clubs, and gatherings. As parties fought for power, innocent bystanders were trapped in the middle. Ambush, gunfire, and bombing attacks increased. Hells Angels used their many alliances and resources to push back the Mongols. The Mongols used guerrilla warfare and psychological warfare to keep their foes on edge. Conflict was evolving. The land battle was becoming an attrition struggle. Both teams were playing deadly chess to outwit one another. The Hells Angels, the biker world's top dogs, had to plan tactically for the first time. After ruling California for so long, it was hard to believe a native could challenge them. However, the Mongols fought for every inch of land. The war deteriorated swiftly, and neither side would surrender. The Mongols vowed to eliminate the Hells Angels and prove they could be as powerful, if not more so, than the organization that had governed California for decades. The Hells Angels increased their efforts and pressured local governments and police to pursue the Mongols. Both parties increased pressure, starting an endless cycle of retaliation and escalation. Violence spread, drawing attention. A private quarrel between two clubs became public. Police increased their efforts to stop the violence when news outlets reported on it. But the Hells Angels and Mongols couldn't stop fighting. The war for California's streets changed illegal motorcycle groups for years. Both Hells Angels and Mongols wanted victory. Fighting was about pride, power, and survival, not just land. Who lasted the longest mattered more than who won the most fights. The war showed that both clubs were in it for the long haul. California's streets were now the site of the ultimate battle between two of the world's most dreaded motorcycle organizations. Territorial control and the war's driving force. The Hells Angels-Mongols rivalry in California was never simply about motorcycles. The lifestyle was symbolized by the famed bikes, but control was the main issue. The streets, communities, and, most significantly, the criminal networks that thrived in California's biker culture were sought. A conflict over bars, roads, and clubs quickly became a power struggle in every sense. Both clubs considered California a crucial battleground. The Hells Angels were the motorcycle world's leaders, thus they didn't want the Mongols to invade their domain. California was where the Mongols set up shop and proved they could challenge the Hells Angels as the best illegal motorcycle club. When the two clubs fought in public, the territory fight went beyond roadside skirmishes. It became a fight for vital enterprises, street corners, and underground markets. Southern California's cities were valuable due to their population, nightlife, and roadways. Biker bars and clubs, gas stations where cross-country motorcyclists refueled, and street corners where drug trades and other criminal activity occurred were major battlegrounds. The Hells Angels, who had a well-organized network, saw these places as both territory and power. One Hells Angel couldn't claim to own a bar or roadway. Their presence allowed the club to police laws, monitor unlawful activity, and exert control throughout the biker community. The Mongols fought for territory and to overthrow the Hells Angels' development regime. They were seeking to dismantle the Hells Angels' empire, not merely gain space in a few key areas. Without the Hells Angels' vast network of supporters and resources, the Mongols made up for it with continual violence and a resolve to do whatever it took to accomplish what they desired. They wanted to capture as much land as possible, make people anxious, and force the Hells Angels to retreat or escalate the carnage. It was a battle of attrition to determine who could last the longest in a violent conflict on the streets and in everyone's hearts and thoughts. Mongols entering Hells Angels territory sparked the first major battle. They had to prove their authority, rather than merely showing up and hoping the Hells Angels would retreat. The Mongols held events, rode in large groups, and displayed their patches in Los Angeles and San Diego, where the Hells Angels had ridden safely. It was planned to provoke the Hells Angels. Clearly, this land isn't just yours anymore. The Hells Angels are known for their brutality, so they had to act. The Angels resisted Mongol pressure. Fighting escalated into street battles, shootings, and explosions. Psychological warfare distinguished this war. This aggressive and public threat to their power was new to the Hells Angels. Mongols were more than a competing club. They threatened everything they had built. In California, their strongest, the Angels showed no weakness. They were the best outlaw motorcycle club. Therefore, the Mongols' challenge was unavoidable. Each street battle and violent dispute tarnished their image. In the realm of criminal motorcycle clubs, reputation was everything. So both clubs incurred injuries and reputation harm. As the combat escalated, both clubs strengthened and gained control of key locations. Hells Angels used their reputation to intimidate their foes. They opened enterprises at pubs and clubs where Mongols were known to hang out or trying to take over. The Mongols set up ambushes, tarnished the Hells Angels' reputation, and showed they weren't afraid to fight dirty. They stated that they will pay any price to take over California. Violence worsened as both clubs established themselves. Early violence was primarily isolated, but as the stakes rose, both sides used harsher means. The Hells Angels, who had long terrorized local businesses and politicians, pressured local government to stop the Mongols. This includes increasing police monitoring and pressuring taverns and clubs to ban Mongols. The Mongols responded by ambushing Hells Angels members at their clubhouses without warning. In response to each other's violence, the violent cycle continued. The fight was now about breaking the other side's will as well as power. As violence increased, California police took notice. It was impossible to ignore the violence, and local authorities were increasingly watching both clubs. Due to their long stay in the state, the Hells Angels had gotten away with a lot. They felt more pressure to behave now. However, their methods remained aggressive. Mongols, who weren't known for their law enforcement ties, were always on the defensive since they couldn't hide from the heavy scrutiny. The California fight took place in courts, political offices, and the core of biker culture. The clubs struggled for power in every way, and as each side pushed back, it became evident that this violent contest would be difficult to conclude. Key incidents that fueled the conflict. A sequence of major events led to the Hells Angels and Mongols clash, worsening their violence and animosity. Every attack, ambush, and demonstration of might widened the gap and made it plain there was no retreat. These were organized attacks to show who was in command, avenge wrongdoers, and warn the other club that peace would not come until one side gave in. The incidents were initially minor, but as both groups got more entrenched, they became more significant, setting the ground for the conflict. The Mongols invaded Hells Angels territory in 1983, one of the crucial incidents that escalated the battle. The Mongols aspired to gain dominance and threaten the Hells Angels' control over Southern California. They organized a large event at a famous motorcycle club. The move was deliberate and gutsy. The Mongols didn't just show up, they announced themselves. They displayed their numbers and pride by wearing their patches and daring opponents. The Hells Angels considered this an insult. They were also concerned about the Mongols taking over the Hells Angels' decades-old territory. Hells Angels reacted promptly, as expected. They all arrived at the pub ready to fight. It was chaos. Bar chairs were smashed, bottles were flung, and people began punching each other instantly. Now a battle zone, the bar was once secure for California bikers. First significant confrontation between clubs was loud, public, and brutal. The California biker scene was shaken. The Mongols said, "We're here, and we're not going anywhere." The Hells Angels were humiliated in their own area. The months worsened the bloodshed. The Hells Angels had always relied on their reputation and might to stay in command, but now they had to cope with a rival who would use violence and fight dirty to obtain what they wanted. In reaction to the Southern California bar incident, Hells Angels raided a Northern California Mongols clubhouse. This wasn't random, it was a message. The Hells Angels wouldn't let the Mongols take over their territory without a battle. The swift, savage raid injured several Mongols. The Mongols attacked Hells Angels members at one of their most protected locations, a pub that had symbolized their authority for years. It became more evident that this wasn't simply about two groups fighting over territory, but about something deeper. A message was sent every time the Mongols assaulted the Hells Angels. It was a claim to live in a Hells Angels-ruled planet. The Hells Angels considered each Mongol invasion as an attack on their identity as much as their land. They developed their dominion by being the world's roughest, most feared, and hardest to touch club. Mongols were more than an enemy, they threatened all the Hells Angels had built. The Mongols attacked Hells Angels members at a motorcycle rally in Northern California, one of the main causes of the war. Perfectly planned and executed, the attack surprised the Hells Angels. Several famous Hells Angels were hurt in the attack, proving that the Mongols could defend themselves and damage the Hells Angels' leadership. This ambush was one of the Mongols' first major attacks on the Hells Angels' main base, changing the conflict. The Hells Angels reacted quickly and harshly. They attacked the Mongols' activities, clubhouses, and members with everything they had. The bloodshed was relentless, and both sides lost many people. These major events altered the conflict. Instead of clashes between rival clubs, there were violent attacks. As street violence extended to public spaces, law police took notice. The fight between two of the most deadly US gangs involved entire neighborhoods, not just bikers. As the bloodshed continued, the Hells Angels and Mongols planned their attacks more deliberately. Hells Angels used their networks to frighten local companies and communities into backing them. They banned Mongols from bars and clubs and monitored their hangouts. The Hells Angels were kept on edge by the Mongols' surprise strikes and guerrilla tactics. Hells Angels ambushed and killed a Mongol outside a Los Angeles pub. One of the biggest events that exacerbated violence was this. The Hells Angels were no longer on the defensive after this brutal murder. They were ready to escalate the fight and defend their territories. In reaction, the Mongols attacked Hells Angels members, worsening the violence and making a speedy solution difficult. Every attack was retaliated brutally at the pinnacle of violence. The battle over California's streets was far from over, as both sides waged a deadly game of one-upmanship. The war's primary events were not random acts of violence. They shaped California's biker culture for years. After each violent incident, both clubs understood there was no turning back. Violence and intimidation tactics on both sides. The Hells Angels and Mongols feud became more than just a battle for California as it escalated. Psychological tactics, intimidation, and strategic dread were used in this multifaceted battle. Both clubs used deliberate violence to undermine the other's power and business, not merely street fights. This escalated to aggressive attacks, weapons, and fear and intimidation that extended from the streets to California's motorcycle culture. The Hells Angels had an advantage over other biker clubs since they were the most powerful. Their violent past earned them a poor image. They maintained dominance for decades with harsh and effective methods. Hells Angels battled the Mongols with the same savagery they had used against prior foes. The Hells Angels had always used fear to intimidate people, so they increased their threats to show the Mongols that California was theirs and that anyone who tried to take it would be punished aggressively. Hells Angels' finest strategy was infiltrating local businesses and groups. Their reputation scared bar and club owners and local police into compliance. Hells Angels attacked businesses that hosted Mongols. The Hells Angels threatened to make your life difficult if you didn't join. It wasn't just about eliminating rival clubs, it was about making people terrified so they'd do what they wanted. In bars, Mongol supporters were confronted with violence or harassment and threats. Owners who refused the Hells Angels faced sabotage, vandalism, or threats that forced them to comply. Many owners banned Mongols and joined the Hells Angels to protect themselves because they were frightened of getting hurt. The Hells Angels used enterprises to pressure the Mongols without fighting them. But the Mongols were just as ruthless. The Hells Angels had a well-established network of supporters and resources, but the Mongols relied more on surprise and unpredictability. They mastered guerrilla warfare to deter Hells Angels. Mongols fought secretly instead of publicly. They utilized ambushes, drive-by shootings, and stealth attacks to keep the Hells Angels on edge and never feel comfortable in their own area. Mongols utilized their violent reputation to terrify their foes. The Hells Angels displayed their strength in public, while the Mongols attacked from the shadows, making them more dangerous and unpredictable. They retaliated when provoked and tried to shock and confuse the Hells Angels to attack them where it stung most. The Mongols were willing to kill specific persons or assault an unprotected Hells Angels member to win. Both clubs realized that in this struggle, perception was as essential as strength. Fear helped keep their members motivated and weaken the enemy side. Every successful strike by the Hells Angels sent a message to the Mongols and anybody else who dared challenge them. They were unstoppable. The Mongols realized they had to break the Hells Angels' invincibility to win this war. They were more likely to prevail if they made the Hells Angels feel threatened and had to protect themselves. The constant violence and threats made people paranoid. Both clubs were always ready for anything, and any interaction may turn violent. In public places like bars or motorbike rallies, members of both clubs had to watch for signs that the other club was ambushing or hanging out. This constant stress made mood erratic and made daily conversation difficult. Having a Mongol in a Hells Angels controlled region, or vice versa, started a battle. The police involvement exacerbated the violence. As the fight between the clubs became public, local authorities had to intervene. Their efforts to stop the bloodshed made the clubs loathe each other more. Both the Hells Angels and the Mongols considered police as another enemy and retaliated against cops who sought to stop them from working. Police officers, once powerful, were now ensnared in an out-of-control fight. The violence spread beyond clubs to passers-by. The increasing tension affected local businesses, bars, and communities. Crossfire regularly injured or killed innocent individuals in the wrong place at the wrong moment. As both clubs used violence and threats to gain dominance, the streets became unsafe. The violence affected everyone since the border between fighters and bystanders blurred. The constant threats, retaliation, and violence made it seem inevitable. The Hells Angels and Mongols fought until one side was defeated. Both clubs used terror, manipulation, and destruction techniques that defined the battle for years. As the violence escalated, it became evident that this was a power struggle without regard for the repercussions. Public and law enforcement reactions to the escalating violence. The police, media, and public became aware of the Hells Angels and Mongols' cruelty as their struggle became public. Small confrontations between two motorcycle organizations quickly escalated into a street battle that drew state and federal officials. Community problems increased due to the club's love of violence, threats, and law-breaking. California's biker wars soon made headlines, spreading dread and uncertainty. It was no longer simply about land ownership. It was about public safety, the rule of law, and possible mass deaths in Central California. Early on, cops exclusively responded to violent situations. As clashes became more regular and brutal, local police couldn't handle it alone. Many officers were caught in the crossfire, hurting or killing people. Police across California worked harder to halt the fighting, but it simply made the two clubs hate each other more. The Hells Angels and Mongols considered the police as foes to be outwitted, making peacekeeping difficult, and how open the escalating violence was worrisome. Shootings and stabbings were now happening in public locations, not only private parties or clubs. Biker rallies, once motorcycle community festivities, turned dangerous powder kegs. Gang violence plagued local schools, bars, and businesses. Innocent people trying to live their lives were entangled in a growing public dispute. This increased unpredictability plagued the police. How could they maintain peace when violence was rampant and unpredictable? Police soon learned that detaining or ticketing a few people wasn't enough to stop these fights. Hells Angels and Mongols have extensive networks beyond bikers. Drug trafficking, organized crime, and local business and government corruption were covered by these networks. This made investigating and punishing club members tougher. The police had problems receiving help from neighborhoods because people were terrified of the clubs generating the violence. In other regions, Hells Angels or Mongols were so common that companies were unwilling to engage with police for fear of being attacked. The Hells Angels and Mongols fought over land and perception. Each team tried to control the story and display their might to their opponents and the public. Both supporters and foes perceived the clubs as ruthless and untouchable as the battle escalated. This affected police response. The Hells Angels, with their long history and global influence, were perceived as a more established power, while the Mongols were seen as a rising threat, an upstart club eager to do everything to prove themselves. The Hells Angels and Mongols benefited and suffered from media exposure. It made both teams appear invincible, but prompted them to adjust their strategies. The conflict between two clubs in a sleepy California town has become a public spectacle. The Mongols had an opportunity to prove they could compete with the best. They were now part of the biker gang and organized crime debate, not simply a little group attempting to make it. Growing public interest was a double-edged sword for Hells Angels. Their reputation was fading, and every new act of violence made it seem like they were losing control of their region. Local, state, and federal police departments collaborated as violence increased. The FBI and ATF grew more interested as it became evident that both clubs were involved in serious crimes outside of their violent fighting. Organized crime, drug trafficking, and arms trading were investigated. The Hells Angels and Mongol criminal organizations were targeted by federal authorities. They sought additional resources and capabilities to do this. This caused many high-profile arrests and court battles, but it also exacerbated club rivalry. The clubs retaliated and attacked more as they believed the cops were after them. Public anxiety, frustration, and fascination accompanied the rising violence. Many people were afraid of the continual possibility of violence in their neighborhoods, but others, notably motorcycle and outlaw subcultures, respected how brave and strong both sides were during the struggle. The Mongols were underdogs versus the Hells Angels, according to some. the Hells Angels' long history as the first and most feared motorcycle gang still inspired others. These folks respected violence, not disapproved of it. As the conflict continued, California streets became more hazardous. Law enforcement struggled to keep up with both groups' changing plans, while the public witnessed the seemingly endless carnage. Every act of violence widened the divide between the clubs. In a bloody world, fighting for California's streets was a war for survival, pride, and identity. Outcomes and impact on both clubs. The Hells Angels and Mongols fight was a draw, but it affected both groups. The conflict began as local territorial fights, but quickly escalated into a full-scale battle that altered California's outlaw motorcycle culture. The clash changed both clubs' fates and motorcycle culture. The Hells Angels' post-war existence displayed their strength and weakness. People always considered them the best motorcycle club, the biggest and most powerful in bikerdom. Their control over vast territories, corporations, and criminal networks in the US and abroad was unquestioned for decades. However, the Mongols' daring approach made the Hells Angels understand their supremacy could be challenged. The Hells Angels kept California, but they had lost strength and their once ironclad reputation. The Mongols' harsh attacks, especially those that garnered media attention, showed the Hells Angels' limits. The long, terrible struggle on their own territory saved them, but it demonstrated they weren't as strong as before. The club was overstretched, and its once perfect reputation began to deteriorate as their violent fights with the Mongols became more prevalent. Both clubs, especially the Mongols, were hampered by law enforcement's greater scrutiny. The Hells Angels also had shattered alliances after the battle. Some of its smaller provincial affiliates questioned their devotion due to increased violence or Mongol control. The Angels understood they couldn't abuse their power since they'd always been faithful and disciplined. It made the corporation reassess its strategy. To maintain control, raw force had to be replaced with more strategic actions. The club had long employed terror as its principal weapon, so losing physical and symbolic land was a wake-up call. Mongols suffered by the fight. They were well known among outlaw motorcycle groups after the fight. They proved their violence and tactics by forcing the Hells Angels to wage a long war on their turf. While the Hells Angels had been around longer, the Mongols had previously shown their prowess. Their membership grew, and their toughness and strength were heard across the nation and world. The Mongols paid dearly for the war. They gained recognition but lost much. People were killed, hurt, or imprisoned, and the war affected their bodies and brains. Mongols also drew police attention. The brutality that distinguished their rise was well known, so local and federal police began breaking up the criminal networks that supported both groups. Being more famous made the Mongols a bigger target. Legal pressure after the war jeopardized their operations. The conflict made them stronger, but the implications of garnering more attention made their future uncertain. Despite these issues, the Mongols grew, capitalizing on their fame. In addition to the land they captured, the conflict left a mark on the outlaw biker community. Mongols proved they could handle Hells Angels' violence. This made them one of the world's most powerful and feared motorcycle clubs. The conflict made them the Hells Angels' principal rival, and their story was one of survival and resilience. Both clubs' internal operations were permanently altered by the conflict. The Hells Angels couldn't assume they would always rule California, so they had to rethink their strategy. The Mongols realized they had to stay strong and face new difficulties despite their previous victories. War cost lives and resources, forcing both clubs to adjust. The brutality of battle taught them that outlaw motorcycle groups were unpredictable. The Hells Angels' Mongol War shaped California's motorcycle culture and beyond. The Hells Angels were no longer the most powerful group. By surviving and battling, the Mongols shifted power. The conflict reminded smaller clubs and independent riders of the risks of defying authority. This fight altered the outlaw biker world as well as the club's fortunes. It was about who could survive the violence and adapt to the changing power relations, not just who held land. Effects on California's biker culture. Hells Angels versus Mongols transformed California's biker culture forever, affecting it across the state and beyond. California is the cradle of outlaw motorcycle gangs, and bikers have always enjoyed riding there for their independence and disobedience. The violent conflict between these two huge clubs disrupted the calm among smaller clubs and transformed how state bikers communicated, organized, and operated their enterprises. The war pitted two clubs against each other and forced the town to contend with violence, terror, and shifting loyalties. California's biker scene had many clubs before the war. Even if they had diverse goals and ideas, most got along. Sometimes opposing groups fought, but most of the time it was about riding, meeting friends, and enjoying the wide road. But the Hells Angels and Mongols' violence escalated, spreading dread and distrust across the state. The persistent fear of violence forced many smaller biker organizations to reassess their roles. The conflict first split the once unified community. Small clubs, which had typically stayed neutral, had to choose sides or leave the conflict. Some clubs joined the Mongols because they feared the Hells Angels or believed in their rise. Due to loyalty, tradition, or the Hells Angels' influence, some stayed. Splitting up the major clubs disrupted California's motorcycle culture's social structure. Biker tensions increased during the conflict, and motorcyclists grew more wary. Formerly safe and neutral California riding became dangerous. Bars and clubs that were once inclusive were attacked. Formerly popular biker rallies and gatherings were no longer cheerful. Instead, bikers watched each other and didn't know who was on which side, creating potential flashpoints for violence. The violence woke up several bikers who weren't involved in the brawl. The conflict showed that the freedom and rebellion that attracted many riders to the lifestyle could no longer be taken for granted. Many bikers wondered if the culture's fraternity and loyalty were still there because they were continually at risk of violence. The friendship meant to unite them now seemed problematic. People who proudly wore club patches now faced danger and distrust. Public opinion was also affected by the Hells Angels-Mongol War. The media began to focus on outlaw bikers after ignoring them for years. The motorcycle culture appeared menacing and out of control when local and national news outlets covered gang fights and violent confrontations. Views of bikers altered greatly. Their past was influenced by romanticized freedom and revolt. The violent clash made many people afraid of a once popular subculture. Police also worked harder to contain the situation. Local and federal law enforcement began cracking down on Hells Angels and Mongol illicit activity during the war. Police increased patrols of bikers since both clubs were involved in drug trafficking, weapon sales, and other illicit activities. Many city police had to choose between maintaining order and dealing with these powerful clubs. Meanwhile, the FBI and ATF intensified its investigations into the club's unlawful activities. The enhanced police and media presence had two impacts. It hindered Hells Angels and Mongols' stealth. Their primarily secretive operations were revealed. However, it strengthened the us versus them mentality at both clubs. The clubs saw the police as another enemy rather than a neutral force trying to restore order. This worsened the cycle of violence and mistrust, as both sides took higher risks to keep their businesses going and show leadership. Smaller groups and independent riders who weren't initially touched by the war were afraid and uncertain afterward. Many people had trouble finding secure locations to gather because bars and clubs that used to be hospitable were now operated by one of the battling groups. Increased tension prevented trusting anyone. Smaller clubs allied with stronger ones to avoid being attacked by larger clubs. The power balance had changed so significantly that even minor clubs had to choose, join a bigger club or face violence. The Hells Angels' feud with the Mongols shattered California's biker culture and redefined outlaw motorcycle riding. The culture used to be about freedom and revolt, but today it's about fear, loyalty, and violence. Unspoken club relationships became a violent war for dominance, leaving the biker world fractured and uncertain. Bikers in California would feel the war's impact for years. Some clubs avoided the violence, while others participated. The long-term legal and cultural consequences. The Hells Angels and Mongol battles affected clubs, motorcycle culture, police, and the public. Though violence subsided, the war's effects lasted decades. The war affected biker culture, legality, and outlaw motorcycle club regulation. The battle's biggest legal outcome was that law enforcement pursued outlaw motorcycle groups as organized criminals. Bikers were disruptive and rowdy pre-war, but not a menace to public safety. The Hells Angels and Mongols are deadly criminal organizations owing to their violence and unlawful behavior. The club's violent fights and drug, gun, and other illegal operations made them more than rival gangs, according to police. They needed internal disintegration and outlaw motorcycle club regulation. The battle's biggest legal outcome was that law enforcement pursued outlaw motorcycle groups as organized criminals. Bikers were disruptive and rowdy pre-war, but not a menace to public safety. The Hells Angels and Mongols are deadly criminal organizations owing to their violence and unlawful behavior. The club's violent fights and drug, gun, and other illegal operations made them more than rival gangs, according to police. They needed internal disintegration. ATF and FBI began targeting illegal motorcycle organizations more aggressively after the war. Hells Angels and Mongol nefarious activities needed investigation. The Hells Angels were formerly one of the most powerful and secretive motorcycle groups, but the war exposed them. Law enforcement targeted Hells Angels members more often for illegal activity. Many important members were arrested for drug trafficking, murder, and racketeering. War-influenced culture. Competing California biker clubs met before the showdown. Conflict and a code of conduct. All motorcycle fans knew they lived differently from club rivalries. The Hells Angels-Mongol War shattered this society. Clubs choose sides, and allegiance often meant violence. Since biker unity was broken, the world is more divided and hostile, with few people to trust. Between two main groups were smaller, clandestine riding organizations. Choose sides or leave war. Conflict split clubs and hindered independent riders and smaller groups. Tribalism increased when minor clubs sided with one of the giants or stayed out of the battle to avoid violence. Many become biased due to stress. As rivalries became personal and aggressive, riding or attending events became risky. The battle changed Americans' views of outlaw bikers for years. Before the war, the media portrayed outlaw bikers as rebels on the outside of society who were still part of American freedom and independence. The media began to portray outlaw bikers as violent, dangerous outlaws who threatened society as violence rose. Today's biker gang represents chaos and destruction, not freedom and resistance. People changed their opinions, and police, who were previously wary of motorcycle clubs, now saw them as major targets for intervention and prosecution. This public perception change impacted Hells Angels and Mongol culture. Outlaws were recruited by both clubs for years. Conflict, law, and media attention changed their image. A violent fighting organization was too perilous for many recruits. Romantic rebel biker vanished. Changing public opinion and law enforcement pressure made recruiting new members tougher and endangered existing members. Aftermath and legacy. The conflict between the Hells Angels and the Mongols had lasting effects on both the law and the culture of outlaw motorcycling. It changed not only how these clubs worked, but also the whole subculture of outlaw bikers in California and other places. Before the fight, a lot of people thought biker clubs were a rebellious but not very dangerous subculture. After the violence between the two clubs got worse, the biker world was no longer a quiet, underground scene. Instead, it became a high-stakes place where violence, legal problems, and the constant threat of being taken down by police were all normal. The war changed both the Hells Angels and the Mongols forever, even though they were known for being strong and tough. Because of the conflict, they had to face a new reality where survival was no longer just about being stronger and being loyal. The clubs could no longer run as they used to because law enforcement was paying more attention to them and the public thought they were more dangerous. The media's portrayal of them as violent criminals made people even more afraid of what they were doing, and the police's focus on shutting down outlaw clubs made things even worse. This change in how people saw outlaw bikers, no longer just a romanticized symbol of freedom, had long-lasting effects on culture. People learned that the biker world was full of violence and danger, which took away the idea that it was a rebellious lifestyle and showed the ugly side of it. The Hells Angels and the Mongols were still important in the criminal world, but they had learned how expensive it was to keep their power. The war showed them that their power was not as strong as they thought, and that to stay alive in this new world, they would need more than just strength. They would also need to be careful about how they moved through a world that was now full of scrutiny and danger.